Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a tremendous difference for us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening, and if you enjoy this content, subscribing really helps us continue bringing you these stories. Now, let's dive in. In the summer of 1988, federal investigators walked into a modest credit union building in Omaha, Nebraska, expecting to find evidence of embezzlement. What they found instead would haunt American conspiracy circles for decades. Documents scattered across desks, wire transfer records showing millions vanishing into untraceable accounts. And somewhere beneath those financial crimes, whispers of something far darker, allegations that would be investigated, dismissed, and then refused to die. This is the story of the Franklin cover-up, a case where the official answer only deepened the questions, and where the line between conspiracy and cover-up became impossible to see. Chapter 1. The Franklin Credit Union Collapse. The Franklin Federal Credit Union occupied a forgettable brick building on North 24th Street in Omaha, serving a predominantly black community that had trusted it for years. By most accounts, it was a modest operation, the kind of place where people deposited paychecks and took out small loans for car repairs. Nothing about its exterior suggested it would become the epicenter of one of America's most persistent conspiracy theories. Lawrence E. King Jr. managed Franklin with an unusual flair for someone running a credit union. He drove expensive cars, threw lavish parties, and travelled frequently to Washington, maintaining connections that seemed oddly sophisticated for a man running a small Nebraska financial institution. To some, King represented success, a black businessman making it in a system that rarely welcomed such achievements. Federal regulators descended on Franklin after routine audits revealed catastrophic discrepancies. The numbers told a devastating story. $40 million unaccounted for. Complex wire transfers moving money through dummy corporations with names that sounded legitimate but existed only on paper. Falsified loan documents showing money lent to entities that didn't exist or people who had never applied for credit. The financial crimes were extensive, systematic, and undeniable. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered a sophisticated scheme. King had been creating phantom loans, then writing checks to himself or his associates as if dispersing loan funds. He had established shell companies that existed solely to receive Franklin's money, then disappear. He had forged board approvals and manufactured documentation to make illegal transactions appear legitimate. The fraud had been running for years, growing bolder as King apparently became confident that nobody was watching closely enough to catch him. The credit union's board of directors claimed ignorance, insisting King had operated with minimal oversight and had manipulated records to hide his activities. Whether this represented genuine deception or willful blindness became a matter of debate, but the board faced no criminal charges. All legal consequences fell on King himself. King was arrested and charged with embezzlement, conspiracy, and defrauding the federal government. The prosecution built an airtight case. King had been running Franklin like his personal bank account, siphoning money for years while covering his tracks with fraudulent paperwork. His attorneys attempted various defences, but the documentation was overwhelming. In 1991, he was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The financial scandal was real, documented and resolved through the legal system. King went to prison. The credit union's victims, ordinary working people who had trusted Franklin with their savings, received partial restitution, though many lost money they could ill afford to lose. By all official measures, justice had been served. The case should have closed there. Another story of greed and white-collar crime, destined to be remembered only by those directly affected. But during the investigation into Franklin's finances, something else emerged. Allegations that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with power, exploitation, and the vulnerability of children in state care. Chapter 2. Allegations emerge. While federal investigators sifted through financial records in Franklin's offices, Other interviews were taking place in conference rooms and social service offices across Nebraska. Foster children, former youth home residents, young adults who had aged out of the state care system. Their stories began circulating among social workers, then law enforcement, then journalists who weren't sure what to make of them. The allegations were explosive. Multiple individuals claimed they had been transported across state lines for purposes of exploitation. They described parties in expensive homes, trips to other cities, encounters with people whose names carried weight in Nebraska politics and business circles. Some spoke of being taken from group homes and foster care placements, used and returned before anyone noticed they were gone. These weren't vague rumours. The accusers provided specific dates, locations and names. They described vehicles, drew layouts of houses they claimed to have visited, and identified people from photographs. The consistency among some of their accounts was striking, too similar to be coincidental, yet too scattered to form a coherent prosecutable case. Among the names that surfaced repeatedly was Lawrence King himself. The allegation suggested that Franklin Credit Union had been more than a criminal enterprise for financial fraud, that it had served as a funding mechanism for something far worse. King's frequent travel, his mysterious connections, his access to vulnerable youth through charitable work, all of it took on sinister dimensions when viewed through this new lens. The accusers came from difficult backgrounds, which both gave their allegations credibility and provided ammunition to dismiss them. Many had been in and out of foster care. Some had histories of behavioural problems or minor legal troubles. Several had struggled with substance abuse or mental health issues. These vulnerabilities made them exactly the kind of victims that predators target. People whose testimony could be easily questioned, whose reliability could be attacked, whose word would be weighed against powerful adults and found wanting. One accuser, Alicia Owen, spoke with disturbing specificity about being taken to parties where adults engaged in activities she should never have witnessed. She named people, described locations, and provided details that investigators found both compelling and impossible to verify through conventional evidence gathering. Her composure during interviews impressed some investigators, while others saw a young woman who had learned to tell convincing stories as a survival mechanism in an unstable life. Paul Bonacci told even more elaborate stories, describing not just local exploitation, but being transported across the country for purposes of abuse and pornography. His accounts included elements that seemed almost fantastical. Claims about being forced to participate in activities that sounded like they came from the darkest corners of organised crime, rather than the reality of Omaha, Nebraska. Yet mixed in with these extreme claims were mundane details that rang true. Specific restaurants, particular hotels, the layout of buildings that he shouldn't have known if he'd never been there. Law enforcement faced an impossible situation. The allegations involved minors, making them inherently sensitive and requiring careful handling. They implicated prominent individuals, making them politically explosive in a state where social and political circles were tightly interconnected. And they came from accusers whose credibility would inevitably be questioned. Young people from troubled backgrounds, some with histories of behavioural problems or involvement with the juvenile justice system. The Nebraska State Patrol and FBI opened investigations. Social workers conducted interviews, trying to establish timelines and verify details. Prosecutors began evaluating whether the allegations could support criminal charges, examining what evidence existed and what could be obtained. The process was careful, quiet, and ultimately led to a decision that would define everything that followed. A grand jury would be convened to examine the evidence and determine what, if anything, had actually happened beyond the financial crimes that everyone agreed had occurred. Chapter 3. The Nebraska Grand Jury. Grand juries operate behind closed doors, examining evidence that never becomes public unless indictments follow. This secrecy serves important purposes, but also breeds suspicion, especially when the grand jury's ultimate conclusion contradicts what many people want to believe. In December of 1989, the Douglas County Grand Jury began hearing testimony related to the Franklin allegations. The proceedings lasted several weeks, involving dozens of witnesses and hundreds of pages of documents. The grand jury's mandate was specific: determine whether credible evidence existed to support criminal charges related to the abuse and trafficking allegations, they heard from the accusers themselves, young people describing events that, if true, represented systematic exploitation on a shocking scale. They reviewed medical records that might show evidence of abuse, or the absence of such evidence. They examined travel documents, financial records, and phone logs that might corroborate or contradict the claims. They listened to testimony from social workers who had interviewed the accusers, law enforcement officers who had investigated the allegations, and individuals whose names had been mentioned in the accusations. The grand jury also heard from mental health professionals who had evaluated some of the accusers. These experts offered opinions about the young people's credibility, their psychological states, and whether their stories seemed consistent with genuine traumatic memory or fabricated narratives. Some experts found the accusers believable, others expressed skepticism, noting inconsistencies, or suggesting that the young people might have been influenced by leading questions or the attention their allegations brought. In February of 1990, the grand jury issued its report. The conclusion was unequivocal. The allegations were a carefully crafted hoax. The report used harsh language, suggesting that the accusers had coordinated their stories, possibly with help from adults who had their own agendas, perhaps seeking publicity, perhaps hoping to sensationalize the Franklin financial scandal into something even bigger. According to the grand jury, the abuse claims were fabrications, created to seek attention and sympathy or to damage reputations. The report went further. It recommended perjury charges against some of the accusers, arguing that they had deliberately lied under oath. This wasn't simply a finding of insufficient evidence, a conclusion that would have left room for ambiguity. This was an accusation that the young people who had come forward were liars who had wasted public resources and damaged innocent reputations through their false testimony. Two of the primary accusers, Alicia Owen and Paul Bonacci, were subsequently charged, tried, and convicted. Owen received a sentence that many considered extraordinarily harsh for perjury, 9 to 15 years in prison. For a young woman with no prior serious criminal record, this sentence seemed designed to do more than punish lying under oath. It seemed designed to destroy her life, to send an unmistakable message about what happened to people who made such allegations against powerful individuals. Bonacci also faced legal consequences for his testimony, though his sentence was less severe than Owen's. The message was clear. The legal system had determined not just that the allegations were unproven, but that they were malicious lies deserving of punishment. The official record was now clear. According to the state of Nebraska's judicial system, the abuse allegations were false. The only criminals beyond King's financial crimes were the young people who had made the accusations in the first place. The case was closed. Justice, according to the official narrative, had been served. But for many observers, the grand jury's conclusion raised more questions than it answered, and the harshness of the response to the accusers seemed less like justice and more like intimidation. Chapter 4. Why Doubt Did Not End. The grand jury's dismissal of the allegations should have ended public interest in the Franklin case. Instead, it intensified scrutiny from independent journalists, concerned citizens, and conspiracy researchers who found the official conclusion unsatisfying. Several factors fueled continuing doubt. First, the grand jury proceedings themselves remained sealed. Unlike a trial where evidence becomes part of public record, grand jury deliberations are confidential. This meant the public had to trust the conclusion without seeing the evidence. For those already suspicious of institutional power, this secrecy felt deliberate. Second, some witnesses later claimed they had been pressured to change their testimony. They described intimidation by investigators, not physical threats, but psychological pressure that made clear what answer was expected. They spoke of being told that if they didn't recant their allegations, they would face criminal charges themselves. They described a process that seemed designed to produce a specific outcome, rather than discover truth wherever it might lead. These claims were impossible to verify independently, but they added to the perception that something had been fundamentally wrong with the investigation. Third, the harsh sentences given to some accusers seemed wildly disproportionate to the crime of perjury. In typical cases, perjury results in probation or short jail sentences especially for young first-time offenders who might have been confused or mistaken rather than deliberately malicious. Owen's sentence of up to 15 years struck many observers as punitive beyond any reasonable standard. Unless authorities were trying to send a message about what happened to people who made such allegations. The sentence looked less like punishment fitting the crime and more like an example being made, a warning to anyone else who might consider coming forward with similar claims. Fourth, certain details from the original allegations were never fully explained. Travel records showed that King had indeed made trips to Washington and other cities on dates that matched some of the accusers' timelines. Photographs surfaced showing King at parties with politically connected individuals, including people who held or would later hold positions of significant power. Financial records confirmed that King had spent lavishly on entertainment and travel. Though spending money wasn't illegal, it aligned with patterns the accusers had described. These verifiable details didn't prove the allegations were true, but they demonstrated that at least some elements of the accusers' stories could be documented. Fifth, inconsistencies in how different accusers were treated raised questions about fairness. Some who recanted their stories faced no consequences, and were even portrayed sympathetically as victims who had been led astray. Others who maintained their stories were prosecuted vigorously. This differential treatment suggested that the system rewarded people who said what authorities wanted to hear and punished those who didn't, hardly a recipe for discovering truth. Finally, the deaths and misfortunes that befell people connected to the case created an atmosphere of fear and speculation. Gary Caradori's plane crash was only the most dramatic example. Other witnesses reported harassment, threats, and mysterious problems that made them reluctant to continue talking about Franklin. Whether these events were coincidental or connected, they became part of the Franklin narrative, adding layers of mystery that the official explanation couldn't dissolve. The case became a litmus test for trust in institutions. Those who believed the grand jury saw vindication of the legal system's ability to reject false accusations, even when they came from sympathetic victims. They saw a process that had worked exactly as designed, examining evidence carefully and reaching a conclusion based on facts rather than emotions. To them, the continuing doubt represented conspiracy thinking run amok, people's refusal to accept legitimate findings because they preferred dramatic narratives to mundane realities. Those who doubted the grand jury saw confirmation of everything they suspected about how power protects itself. They saw a process designed to produce a predetermined outcome, where evidence that supported the powerful was emphasized and evidence that challenged them was dismissed. They saw young people from vulnerable backgrounds being sacrificed to protect the reputations of influential adults. To them, the official conclusion represented institutional corruption at its most efficient. Not crude cover-up, but sophisticated manipulation of legal processes to achieve desired results. Neither side could prove the other wrong, and so the argument continued, growing more entrenched with each passing year. Chapter 5. Media coverage and silence. When the Franklin Credit Union first collapsed, national media gave the story moderate attention. The Washington Times ran several articles examining King's connections to Republican Party fundraising circles. Local Nebraska media covered the scandal extensively. But when the abuse allegations surfaced, something strange happened. Initial interest from major outlets evaporated almost overnight. The story that had seemed poised to become a national scandal was suddenly treated as settled. A handful of journalists who continued investigating found their work rejected or buried. Several reporters later described their experiences trying to cover Franklin. Editors who had initially encouraged investigations suddenly lost interest. Stories that had been approved for publication were killed at the last minute without clear explanation. Sources who had been willing to talk on the record suddenly stopped returning calls, or claimed they had been misquoted in earlier interviews. In a few cases, journalists reported receiving warnings, never explicit threats, but messages from sources or colleagues suggesting that pursuing the Franklin story would be bad for their careers, that they were venturing into territory where they weren't welcome. One newspaper, the Lincoln Journal-Star, did publish investigative pieces that questioned the official narrative. Their reporting raised legitimate questions about the grand jury process and the severity of sentences given to accusers. But even this coverage was relatively muted. careful to avoid making direct accusations and quick to present official denials alongside sceptical inquiry. The reporting was thorough but safe, asking questions without pushing too hard for answers. The most notable exception to mainstream media silence was a British television documentary. Yorkshire Television produced Conspiracy of Silence, a film examining the Franklin allegations in detail. The documentary featured interviews with accusers who maintained their stories despite the perjury convictions. It included testimony from investigators who believed the young people were telling the truth. It presented evidence that seemed to contradict the grand jury's conclusions: photographs, travel records, witness statements that had apparently been dismissed or ignored. The documentary was scheduled to air on the Discovery Channel in May of 1994. Promotional materials were prepared. TV guide listings included it in the schedule, and then, at the last minute, the programme was pulled. According to later reports that were never officially confirmed, the programme was bought by parties unknown, and copies were supposedly destroyed to prevent it from ever airing. Whether this was a business decision based on legal concerns, editorial judgment about the documentary's reliability, or something more sinister became another unanswered question in the Franklin story. A rough cut of Conspiracy of Silence eventually leaked and began circulating among conspiracy researchers, passed from person to person on VHS tapes, and later uploaded to early video sharing websites. The leaked version was clearly unfinished, missing final edits and polish, but its content was explosive. Watching it, viewers could understand why it might have been suppressed. It presented a coherent, disturbing narrative that directly contradicted official findings and portrayed powerful individuals in deeply unflattering ways. The documentary's suppression became legendary in itself, cited as evidence that powerful forces didn't want this story told, that media could be controlled or intimidated into silence, that certain topics were simply off limits regardless of their news value. Whether the suppression was sinister or mundane, the effect was the same. It reinforced the perception that something was being hidden. Some journalists who covered Franklin experienced professional consequences that seemed connected to their reporting. Their editors killed stories, citing vague concerns about liability or source reliability. Sources stopped cooperating, sometimes claiming they had been visited by law enforcement or private investigators, asking about their contact with reporters. In a few cases, reporters claimed they received warnings, never explicit threats, but messages suggesting that pursuing the Franklin story would be bad for their careers, that certain people were watching their work with concern. These experiences created a chilling effect. Journalists talked to each other, and word spread in newsrooms. Franklin was radioactive, a story that could damage your career without advancing it, a rabbit hole that led nowhere useful. Young reporters were steered away from it. Editors discouraged interest. The informal mechanisms of media self-censorship worked efficiently, requiring no conspiracy or coordination, just individual decisions by cautious people who saw no upside in pursuing a story that had already been officially resolved. The result was an information vacuum. Without mainstream media coverage, the Franklin story lived primarily in alternative publications, conspiracy newsletters, and early internet forums. This gave conspiracy theorists free rein to interpret events without fact-checking or editorial oversight. Theories proliferated without anyone with institutional credibility pushing back or providing verified information. It also meant that legitimate questions about the case were automatically associated with fringe theories, making serious examination more difficult. Media silence created space where any explanation seemed possible, because no authoritative voice was providing verified information to anchor public understanding. The conspiracy version of events flourished not because evidence supported it, but because the official version was barely defended, leaving people to draw their own conclusions from fragments of information and a general sense that something didn't add up. Chapter 6. The Investigator's Death. Gary Caradori was a private investigator based in Lincoln, Nebraska. A former State Patrol officer, he had built a reputation for thorough, aggressive investigation work. In 1989, the Nebraska Legislature's Executive Board hired Caradori to investigate the Franklin allegations independently. Reflecting some legislators' discomfort, with how authorities were handling the case. Caradori took the assignment seriously. He travelled to Chicago, Denver, and other cities following leads. He interviewed accusers at length, recording hours of testimony. He collected documents and evidence that he believed supported at least some of the allegations. According to people who worked with him, Caradori became convinced that something criminal had occurred. In July of 1990, Caradori told colleagues he had obtained critical evidence, something that would break the case open, that would provide the proof needed to move forward with criminal charges. He was excited, energized in a way that colleagues said they hadn't seen from him before. He flew to Chicago to meet a source, bringing his 8-year-old son along for what was supposed to be a quick trip. The boy was out of school for the summer, and Caradori apparently saw no reason not to bring him along on what seemed like a routine evidence collection. On July 11th, flying back to Nebraska in his small plane, Caradori radioed that he was experiencing mechanical trouble. It was early evening, weather clear, visibility good. He reported problems to air traffic control, his voice calm and professional, not panicked, just communicating a developing situation that required attention. Moments later, the plane broke apart in mid-air over Illinois. Caradori and his son were killed instantly. Wreckage scattered across a cornfield, pieces of the aircraft spread over a wide area in a pattern that suggested the plane had come apart violently at altitude rather than crashing intact. The official investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the crash was an accident, likely caused by structural failure related to the age and maintenance history of the aircraft, a Piper Saratoga that had seen considerable use and may not have received optimal maintenance. But the circumstances fed speculation immediately. Caradori had just told people he had breakthrough evidence. He died before delivering it, and crucially, no evidence from his Chicago trip was recovered from the crash site. Whatever documents or photographs he had obtained were either destroyed in the crash, scattered and lost in the cornfield, or never recovered from the wreckage despite intensive searching. Witnesses near the crash site reported seeing the plane explode in mid-air, with pieces flying off before the main body of the aircraft went down. A description more consistent with a bomb or sabotage than typical mechanical failure. The NTSB report noted that the plane's wing had separated from the fuselage, but attributed this to failure of the wing attachment points rather than external causes like an explosive device. Conspiracy theorists pointed out that bombs and wing attachment failures produce similar results in crashes, making them difficult to distinguish in post-crash analysis, especially when much of the wreckage is destroyed on impact. The NTSB investigation was thorough by normal standards. Investigators examined the wreckage, interviewed witnesses, reviewed maintenance records, and analysed the flight data available to them. They found no evidence of sabotage, no explosive residue, no signs of tampering with the aircraft's systems, nothing that suggested foul play. But they also acknowledged that the condition of the wreckage made definitive conclusions difficult. Much of the aircraft was destroyed on impact, and critical components that might have shown evidence of sabotage were too damaged to yield clear answers. Caradori's widow and some of his colleagues openly questioned whether the crash was truly accidental. They noted that intimidation and warnings had been reported by others investigating Franklin, anonymous phone calls, vehicles following people home, subtle pressure that made clear someone was watching. They emphasized the convenient timing. Caradori dies just as he's about to reveal evidence, and the evidence dies with him. The fact that his young son also perished added emotional weight to the tragedy, making the loss feel even more cruel if it was indeed murder rather than accident. The death remains officially classified as an accident. No evidence of foul play was ever established that met legal or investigative standards for concluding the crash was anything other than what the NTSB determined. But in the Franklin narrative, Caradori's crash became a turning point. The moment when investigation became dangerous, when people started dying, when the costs of asking questions became potentially lethal. Whether the crash was truly an accident or something more sinister, its effect was undeniable. Other investigators became more cautious. Witnesses who had been willing to talk reconsidered. The message, intentional or not, was clear. Pursuing Franklin could have fatal consequences. Chapter 7. The legal aftermath. Following the grand jury's report, the legal system moved decisively against the accusers. The message was unambiguous. Making allegations without sufficient proof would result in severe consequences, especially when those allegations targeted prominent individuals and institutions. Alicia Owen, who had been one of the most detailed and consistent witnesses, was convicted of perjury and sent to prison. Her trial was brief, the outcome seemingly predetermined. The prosecution argued that she had knowingly lied under oath, fabricating elaborate stories for attention or out of malice toward people who had done nothing wrong. The defence attempted to argue that even if her testimony contained inaccuracies, she believed what she was saying, that mistakes of memory or interpretation shouldn't be treated as perjury. The jury wasn't persuaded. Owen's sentence was shocking, up to 15 years for lying under oath, a punishment that seemed designed to destroy her life rather than simply correct wrongdoing. For comparison, people convicted of assault, theft, or drug distribution often received lighter sentences. The disparity suggested that Owen's real crime wasn't perjury itself, but daring to accuse powerful people of terrible things. Owen maintained her story throughout her incarceration. She never recanted, never admitted fabrication, never wavered in her claims that she'd been telling the truth about what happened to her. During her years in prison, she gave occasional interviews to alternative media outlets and conspiracy researchers, always insisting that she had been punished for being honest, rather than for lying. She served years before her sentence was eventually reduced, emerging as a figure that conspiracy theorists lionized and officials dismissed as someone who had lied and then stubbornly refused to admit it, even when doing so might have secured earlier release. Paul Bonacci faced similar consequences. He was convicted of perjury related to his Franklin testimony. The case against him was complicated by his history of mental health issues and his sometimes fantastic-sounding claims that included elements beyond the Franklin allegations, stories that seemed designed to test credibility. But Bonacci's story took an unexpected turn years later that created one of the most bizarre contradictions in the entire Franklin saga. In 1999, Bonacci filed a civil lawsuit against Lawrence King, alleging abuse during the period when King was running Franklin. In a strange legal outcome, Bonacci won the case by default judgment. King, serving his sentence for financial fraud, didn't contest the lawsuit and was awarded $1 million in damages. The judgment didn't mean a court had validated Bonacci's accusations in the criminal sense, since King didn't defend himself and no evidence was tested through adversarial process. But it created an extraordinary contradiction. Convicted of lying about abuse in criminal proceedings, yet awarded damages for that same abuse in civil court. This contradiction became another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit neatly together. How could the same claims be both malicious lies worthy of prison time and valid grounds for civil damages? Skeptics pointed out that default judgments proved nothing since they're uncontested, that Bonacci had essentially been awarded money by a court without having to prove his case. Believers argued that King's failure to contest the lawsuit was telling. If the allegations were truly false, why not defend yourself and avoid a $1 million judgment? Other individuals connected to the allegations scattered. Some recanted their stories, appearing at press conferences or in interviews to say they had been confused, pressured into making false accusations by investigators or advocates who wanted to believe the worst. These recantations were presented as evidence that the grand jury had been right all along, that vulnerable young people had been manipulated into making claims they knew weren't true. But the recantations raised their own questions. Several of those who recanted did so only after facing legal pressure or after receiving offers of immunity from prosecution. Some later recanted their recantations, saying they had been coerced into denying what they had originally truthfully reported. The cycle of claim, recantation, and reaffirmation made sorting truth from lies nearly impossible. Others moved away from Nebraska, declining to discuss Franklin at all. They disappeared into quiet lives elsewhere, refusing interviews and avoiding any public connection to the case. Whether this represented people wanting to move past false accusations they regretted, or victims who had been silenced and intimidated into permanent silence, depended on your interpretation. A few continued speaking out, appearing in documentaries and giving interviews to conspiracy researchers, but their credibility remained forever contested. They became permanent fixtures in the Franklin mythology, living symbols of either persistent truth-telling or stubborn refusal to admit deception. Civil cases emerged sporadically over the years. Some were settled quietly, with non-disclosure agreements ensuring that whatever evidence existed would never become public. The settlements were often small, amounts that suggested nuisance payments rather than admission of wrongdoing, enough to make litigation go away without admitting liability. Others were dismissed for a lack of evidence or procedural reasons. None resulted in criminal prosecutions beyond the perjury convictions. The legal aftermath created a paradox. According to criminal court, the accusations were lies. According to at least one civil court, the abuse had occurred. Both could not be simultaneously true, yet both were official legal findings. This contradiction became another piece of the puzzle that conspiracy theorists emphasized and skeptics explained away, evidence that could support either interpretation depending on what you already believed. In Chapter 8, Why the Story Survived. Most scandals fade, official reports are issued, media coverage ends, and public attention moves to newer controversies. The Franklin case should have followed this pattern, disappearing into historical footnotes. Instead, it survived and even grew in the public imagination. Several factors explain its persistence. First, timing. The Franklin allegations emerged in the late 1980s, just as Americans were becoming increasingly suspicious of institutional power. Watergate was still fresh in cultural memory. The Iran-Contra scandal had revealed that government officials could lie systematically. Trust in authority was eroding, creating fertile ground for stories about powerful people escaping accountability. Second, the involvement of children. Allegations involving minors carry emotional weight that financial crimes never do. Even skeptics become more receptive when children might be victims. The Franklin case pushed psychological buttons that made it impossible to dismiss casually. Third, the exposure of real abuse scandals elsewhere. In subsequent decades, numerous instances of systematic abuse by powerful institutions came to light. The Catholic Church scandals revealed abuse that church hierarchy had covered up systematically. The Penn State Sandusky case showed how beloved institutions could hide crimes for years. The Jeffrey Epstein trafficking network demonstrated that wealthy individuals could exploit minors while powerful people looked away. Each revelation validated the premise that powerful people could exploit vulnerable populations and escape consequences. The confirmed conspiracies gave retrospective credibility to earlier allegations like Franklin. If it happened in the Catholic Church, if it happened at Penn State, if it happened with Epstein, why not in Omaha? Fourth, the internet. As web forums, blogs, and later social media developed, the Franklin case found new life online. Documents were scanned and shared, grand jury reports, court transcripts, newspaper articles from the period. The suppressed Yorkshire television documentary leaked and spread through file-sharing networks and video platforms. Researchers created comprehensive websites analysing every detail, compiling timelines and evidence in ways that had never been possible in the pre-digital era. The internet allowed people interested in Franklin to find each other, creating communities that kept the story alive through discussion and investigation. New generations discovered the case and brought fresh perspectives. Information that might have been lost in old newspaper archives or courthouse files became searchable and accessible, allowing armchair investigators to piece together narratives that competed with official versions. Fifth, the case's persistent ambiguity. Franklin never had a clear resolution that satisfied both sides. Unlike cases where conspiracy theories are conclusively debunked with overwhelming evidence, Franklin remained contested territory. The grand jury said one thing, accusers said another, and the evidence could be interpreted either way depending on your starting assumptions about institutional trustworthiness and the credibility of vulnerable witnesses. This ambiguity kept the argument alive because neither side could deliver a knockout blow. Skeptics couldn't point to definitive proof that the accusations were lies. Perjury convictions are legal findings, not proof of malicious fabrication. Believers couldn't point to criminal convictions of the accused. Absence of prosecution doesn't prove innocence, but it doesn't prove guilt either. The case existed in a frustrating middle space where certainty was impossible. Finally, the symbolic power. Franklin became larger than itself, a story that encapsulated fears about power, privilege, and justice that resonated far beyond Nebraska. Whether or not the specific allegations were true, the case represented something many people believed was fundamentally true about how the world worked, that the wealthy and connected could commit crimes and use their influence to avoid consequences, that systems ostensibly designed for justice could be manipulated to protect the powerful, that vulnerable people who challenged this arrangement would be crushed. Franklin stopped being primarily about what happened in Omaha and became a parable about power and its abuses. It became a story people told to illustrate broader truths they believed about society, how institutions protect themselves, how money and connections matter more than justice, how the system is rigged against ordinary people and especially against those without resources or status. This transformation from specific case to general symbol ensured Franklin's survival. Even people who didn't know the details, who couldn't name the accusers or remember when the grand jury met, knew Franklin as shorthand for institutional cover-up and the failure of justice. It entered the cultural vocabulary as an example, a reference point, a cautionary tale whose specifics mattered less than what it represented. Chapter 9. Conspiracy versus Conclusion. Decades later, the Franklin case remains sharply divided between two irreconcilable narratives. The official conclusion is straightforward. Lawrence King committed financial fraud. During the investigation, false allegations of abuse emerged. A grand jury examined these allegations and determined they were fabricated. Some accusers were convicted of perjury. The case was resolved. No broader criminal network existed. The conspiracy theories are based on misunderstandings and speculation. This version emphasizes the grand jury process as thorough. It notes that accusers had credibility problems. It points to perjury convictions as proof the system worked. It explains media silence as responsible journalism. It attributes Caradori's death to an unfortunate accident. It sees continued belief in conspiracy as distrust in authority and preference for sensational narratives. The conspiracy interpretation tells a radically different story. King was involved in something far worse than embezzlement, exploiting vulnerable youth and providing access to them for politically connected individuals who attended parties and gatherings where abuse occurred. When allegations emerged threatening to expose this network, powerful people intervened to shut down the investigation before it could reach them. The grand jury was manipulated or pressured to reach a predetermined conclusion that protected influential individuals. Accusers were silenced through intimidation and prosecution, turned into criminals for telling uncomfortable truths. Evidence was destroyed or hidden, witnesses died under suspicious circumstances, and media coverage was suppressed through pressure on outlets and journalists. The cover-up succeeded, leaving only fragments of truth scattered among official denials. This version emphasizes the sealed nature of grand jury proceedings as suspicious rather than standard. It notes the harsh sentences given to accusers as evidence of intimidation rather than appropriate punishment. It points to Caradori's death as too conveniently timed to be accidental. It sees media silence as orchestrated suppression rather than editorial judgment. It interprets the lack of prosecutions as proof of cover-up rather than absence of evidence. It views official denials with fundamental skepticism, assuming that institutions lie to protect themselves and that public statements rarely reflect private reality. Between these extremes lie more nuanced positions that rarely get heard in polarized discussions. Some believe the allegations had kernels of truth, but were exaggerated or misunderstood, that perhaps King was involved in exploitation on some level, but not a vast network, that some accusers were truthful while others fabricated details. Perhaps the investigation was flawed without being completely corrupt, incompetent rather than malicious, rushed rather than deliberately manipulated. Some observers focus on process failures without reaching conclusions about ultimate truth. They note that sealed proceedings and harsh treatment of accusers created legitimate reasons for public doubt, that even if the grand jury reached the correct conclusion, the way it was handled guaranteed continuing controversy, They argue that transparency matters as much as accuracy, that justice must not only be done, but be seen to be done, and that Franklin failed this test regardless of underlying facts. The evidence doesn't definitively support any single interpretation. Financial crimes occurred, that's undisputed fact, proven through trials and convictions. Allegations were made, also undisputed, documented in investigative records and grand jury proceedings. A grand jury dismissed those allegations. Official record, legally binding conclusion. Some accusers were convicted of perjury, legal fact established through trials. Gary Caradori died in a plane crash. Tragic reality confirmed by NTSB investigation. Beyond these established facts, almost everything else is interpretation, inference and belief, shaped by prior assumptions about institutional credibility and the reliability of vulnerable witnesses. No court has validated the conspiracy claims. No evidence has emerged that definitively proves a cover-up occurred. No powerful figure implicated in the allegations has ever been criminally charged or convicted in connection with Franklin. By legal standards and evidentiary requirements, the case is closed and the conspiracy theory is unproven speculation. Yet significant questions remain unanswered in ways that fuel continuing doubt. Why were some allegations so detailed and consistent across multiple accusers who allegedly had no contact with each other? Why did some experienced investigators believe the accusers despite their credibility problems? Why was media coverage so remarkably limited for a story with national implications? Why did the grand jury proceedings remain sealed decades later when the investigation was supposedly straightforward? Why were sentences for perjury so extraordinarily harsh? These questions don't prove conspiracy, but they explain why doubt persists among people who aren't simply conspiracy theorists reflexively distrusting authority. They represent genuine anomalies that the official narrative doesn't adequately address, gaps between what official conclusions say and what the surrounding circumstances suggest. The Franklin case exists in a space where legal findings and public perception diverge fundamentally. Courts concluded one thing through established legal processes. Many citizens believe another based on their reading of available evidence and their assessment of institutional trustworthiness. Both sides accuse the other of refusing to see obvious truth, conspiracy theorists blinded by paranoia, or skeptics blinded by naive faith in institutions, and after more than 30 years consensus seems impossible. Epilogue: what the Franklin case really represents. The Franklin cover-up, whatever its ultimate truth, has become something larger than a historical case file. It's a parable about institutional trust, about the gap between official explanations and public belief, about how allegations can outlive investigations. For those who believe the conspiracy version, Franklin represents the ultimate failure of justice, a case where power protected itself through suppression of truth. It confirms their suspicions about who holds real power and what they're capable of doing to maintain it. For those who accept the official conclusion, Franklin represents how sensational allegations can spread despite lacking evidence, how people can reject legitimate findings because they prefer dramatic narratives, how refusing to accept official answers creates endless speculation. For those in the middle, Franklin represents the possibility that we might never know the truth about certain events, that ambiguity is sometimes the only honest answer, that some questions remain questions forever. The most lasting legacy of the Franklin case might not be any particular fact about what happened, but what it revealed about the fragility of truth in complex institutional settings. When investigations happen behind closed doors, when records remain sealed, when media coverage is limited, when consequences fall on the powerless rather than the powerful, even a legitimate conclusion can appear suspicious. Even an honest process can look like a cover-up. Even justice properly administered can seem like injustice from certain angles. The Franklin case teaches that institutional credibility is earned through transparency, not asserted through authority. That the appearance of fairness matters as much as fairness itself. That unanswered questions, even small ones, can fester into permanent doubt that undermines public trust. That protecting institutional reputation by avoiding transparency often backfires, creating more suspicion than whatever was being hidden. It teaches that vulnerable witnesses present unique challenges. Their stories deserve serious investigation despite credibility problems, yet those same credibility problems make definitive conclusions difficult. That the legal system's adversarial nature can seem like victimization when it targets those who made allegations rather than those they accused. That harsh punishment of witnesses, even if legally justified, sends messages that extend far beyond individual cases. The Franklin case also reveals something about American society's relationship with conspiracy theories. We're a nation founded on distrust of concentrated power, with constitutional systems designed around assumption that institutions will abuse authority if not carefully constrained. This healthy skepticism can metastasize into reflexive distrust, where no official explanation is ever accepted, where every denial becomes confirmation of cover-up, where the absence of evidence proves only that evidence was destroyed. But the opposite danger is equally real. Naive faith in institutions that blinds people to actual corruption. Assumption that official findings must be correct because officials conducted them. Refusal to question authority even when questioning is warranted. Finding the balance between appropriate skepticism and corrosive cynicism remains an ongoing challenge. In the end, perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Franklin story is not what was proven, or unproven, but the very fact that we're still talking about it. Decades later, no consensus exists. Both sides remain convinced of their interpretation. The case won't be resolved by new evidence at this point. Too much time has passed. Too many principles have died. Too many records are sealed or lost or were never created in the first place. What remains is a story that won't stay quiet, allegations that won't be forgotten, and questions that outlived the institutions that claim to answer them. Whether the Franklin cover-up was a genuine conspiracy, a miscarriage of justice, or a tragic misunderstanding where vulnerable young people made false accusations for complex psychological reasons, it stands as a reminder that sometimes the most troubling mysteries are not about hidden truths waiting to be discovered, but about why we stopped trusting the official story in the first place. The case file may be closed, gathering dust in archives that few people access, but the conversation continues in internet forums and conspiracy documentaries, in academic discussions about institutional accountability and public trust, in ongoing debates about how societies should handle allegations against the powerful. And perhaps that continuation itself tells us something important about power, justice, and the spaces where trust fails. Sometimes the absence of closure is the story. Sometimes the questions matter more than the answers. Sometimes a case becomes immortal, not because it revealed truth, but because it revealed how difficult truth can be to find when institutions close ranks, when witnesses are vulnerable, when evidence is ambiguous, and when power has every incentive to make uncomfortable questions disappear. The Franklin cover-up will likely never be definitively resolved. It exists now in the realm of contested history, where facts give way to interpretation, and evidence yields to belief. Future researchers will examine it, new documentaries will revisit it, and each generation will bring fresh perspectives shaped by their own experiences with institutional power and failure. What happened in Omaha in the late 1980s? The honest answer, the uncomfortable answer, the answer that satisfies no one completely, is that we cannot say with certainty. We have court findings, witness testimony, investigative reports, and decades of analysis. We have facts and claims and denials and suspicions. But certainty, that remains elusive, perhaps forever beyond our grasp. And maybe that uncertainty, that permanent ambiguity, is the real legacy of Franklin. A reminder that some truths resist simple telling, that power often operates in shadows where evidence is scarce, and that the search for justice sometimes ends not in resolution but in enduring questions that refuse to die. Before we begin tonight's investigation, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the unknown, hit that hype button and let the algorithm know this content matters. And if you want, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We love seeing our community spread across every time zone, every continent, listening to these stories as they drift off to sleep or start their day. Your comments remind us that real people are still out there, still curious, still questioning. Now, let's descend into one of the most disturbing conspiracy theories of the digital age. The dead internet, the operator in the wires. Imagine discovering that everyone you've been talking to online for the past decade wasn't real. That every argument, every joke, every seemingly human interaction was manufactured by something else. That the internet you remember, the chaotic and vibrant place it once was, died years ago and nobody told you. This is the story of one man who stumbled onto evidence that suggests the web as we know it has been replaced by an automated ghost, and his investigation into what he called the operator in the wires. This is the dead internet theory, and what you're about to hear will change how you see every comment section, every forum post, every social media feed you scroll through for the rest of your life. The last real post, September 2014, a small apartment in Portland, Oregon. Evan Carter sat hunched over his laptop at 3 a.m, comparing two screenshots side by side. The left image showed a YouTube video he'd saved back in 2010, an obscure documentary about urban exploration. The comment section was alive, chaotic, human. Arguments about the ethics of trespassing spiraled into discussions about property rights, gentrification, the philosophy of public space. One user named Tunnel Rat had written a 3-paragraph essay about the abandoned subway stations beneath Cincinnati. Another named Ghost Walker replied with their own story about exploring a shuttered hospital in Detroit. The thread went on for what seemed like forever, dozens of real people sharing real experiences, disagreeing, joking, connecting. The right image showed the same video, pulled up just hours ago in September 2014. The comment section was completely different. Gone were Tunnel Rat and Ghost Walker. Gone were the sprawling debates and personal stories. Instead, the comments read like templates. Great video! This is so interesting. Thanks for sharing. Love this content. Every single one generic, brief, sterile. Accounts with names like user7492 or random viewer followed by strings of letters. All created within the last year. All posting the same bland enthusiasm across hundreds of unrelated videos. Evan checked the view count. It matched his screenshot from 2010. The video itself was identical, but the entire human presence surrounding it had been erased and replaced with something that felt artificial, hollow, programmed. He opened his journal and wrote a single sentence that would consume the next decade of his life. I think the comments were deleted, or the people themselves were. This was the moment Evan Carter fell into the dead internet rabbit hole, and the moment he began documenting evidence that the web had died sometime between 2012 and 2016. What he found would be dismissed by most as paranoid conspiracy, but the patterns he uncovered, the timeline he constructed, the connections he drew between real documented events, and the strange homogenization of online discourse all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The internet had been quietly replaced by something designed to simulate human presence while eliminating authentic human chaos, and something, or someone, was operating the system from behind the curtain. Act 1. When the internet still felt human. To understand what Evan discovered, you have to remember what the internet used to be. Not the sanitized, algorithm-driven, engagement-optimized platform ecosystem we have now, but the messy, unpredictable, genuinely human space that existed in the 2000s. From 2004 through 2008, the web was chaotic in the best possible way. Forums thrived on every niche topic imaginable. MySpace pages were disasters of clashing colours and auto-playing music, each one a unique expression of whoever built it. Early YouTube comment sections were war zones of genuine disagreement, inside jokes, and bizarre tangents that had nothing to do with the video itself. Reddit was a collection of weird communities that felt genuinely underground. Internet culture was fractured, diverse, impossible to predict or control. Then something shifted. 2009, Google launched what it called large-scale personalization experiments. The company began tailoring search results to individual users, tracking behaviour, building profiles, optimizing for engagement. At the time, this seemed like an improvement, a way to make the internet more relevant and useful. But it also meant that the shared reality of search results began to fragment. Two people searching the same term would see completely different information based on what the algorithm decided they wanted to see. 2011. Google rolled out an algorithm update called Panda. Officially, it was designed to reduce low-quality content in search results and promote authoritative sources. In practice, it wiped out millions of small personal websites overnight. Blogs that had existed for years disappeared from search results entirely. Niche forums with dedicated communities became invisible. The web's long tail, all those strange little corners where real people gathered around obscure interests, was systematically deprioritized in favour of major platforms and corporate media sites. Evan noticed this in real time. Websites he'd bookmarked years earlier, forums where he'd spent hours reading threads about everything from vintage synthesizers to Soviet architecture, stopped showing up in searches. When he navigated directly to them, they were still there, but they felt abandoned. Post frequency had dropped. Active users had vanished. It was as if Google's algorithm hadn't just hidden these sites, but had somehow killed them by making them impossible to discover. 2012. Facebook revealed something that should have been a much bigger scandal than it was. The company admitted it had been running emotional manipulation experiments on its users. The Facebook Emotional Contagion study showed that by tweaking what appeared in people's news feeds, Facebook could reliably alter their emotional states. Show someone more negative posts, they'd become more negative. Show them more positive posts, they'd become more positive. The experiment proved that algorithmic control of information could directly control human psychology. But here's what disturbed Evan more than the study itself: how little anyone seemed to care. The story broke. There was a brief wave of outrage, then it disappeared beneath the next news cycle. It was as if people had collectively shrugged and accepted that yes, the platforms we use every day are actively manipulating our emotions, and that's just how things are now. Evan began comparing archived snapshots of websites using the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. He pulled pages from 2008, 2010, 2012, and 2014, looking at the same forums, the same YouTube channels, the same news sites over time. The difference was profound and disturbing. Pages from 2008 were messy. Spelling errors everywhere, grammar mistakes, people typing in stream of consciousness bursts, going off on tangents, arguing passionately about trivial things. Comment sections sprawled in every direction with no clear structure. Usernames were creative, weird, personal. You could feel individual personalities behind each post. Pages from 2014 were sterile. Perfect grammar and spelling, or at least consistent errors. Opinions that felt calculated rather than spontaneous. Comment sections that stayed rigidly on topic. Usernames that felt generated. Random combinations of words and numbers. Everything felt curated, managed, algorithmic. Evan wrote in his journal, "It feels like the internet was replaced by something sterile, something curated. Like someone remade it to look the same but removed all the human chaos that made it real." He started creating spreadsheets, documenting the changes. He tracked active users across multiple platforms, noting when accounts went silent, when new accounts appeared, patterns in posting behaviour. What he found was that around 2012 there was a massive shift. Thousands of accounts that had been active for years simply stopped posting. New accounts appeared to replace them, but these new accounts behaved differently, more predictable, more uniform, less human. Act 2. The year everything changed. June 2013. Edward Snowden released classified documents exposing the scope of NSA surveillance programs. The world learned that the US government had been collecting data on virtually every digital communication for years. Phone calls, emails, web browsing, all of it harvested and stored in massive data centres. Most people focused on the privacy implications, the constitutional questions, the debate over security versus freedom. Evan focused on something else, a small detail buried in thousands of pages of leaked documents that most researchers ignored because the wording was unclear. The document referenced a program called PRISM, which most people know about, a system for collecting and analysing data from major tech companies. But in the technical specifications there was a reference to something called Tumult, described as a system designed to replicate public texture in data environments. Evan read that phrase over and over. Replicate public texture in data environments. What did that mean? The document didn't elaborate. There were no follow-up references. It appeared once in a single technical specification sheet, then never again. Evan's interpretation: Tumult was a system designed to simulate public behaviour online, to create artificial texture that would make data environments, meaning social platforms and forums, feel authentically populated even if they weren't. To manufacture the appearance of genuine human presence. He knew this was speculation. He had no proof. But the timing bothered him. Tumult was referenced in documents dated 2012, the same year Evan noticed the shift in online behaviour, the same year Facebook admitted to running emotional manipulation experiments, the same year the internet started feeling different. 2015. Reddit underwent massive restructuring. The platform banned several controversial subreddits, purged thousands of accounts, and replaced much of its leadership. The official explanation was that Reddit was cracking down on harassment and hate speech. But users noticed something else. After the purge, the platform felt different. Conversations became more uniform. Opinions fell into predictable patterns. The weird, chaotic energy that had defined Reddit culture seemed to drain away, replaced by something more managed and controlled. 2016. Twitter admitted that over 48 million accounts on the platform were bots, nearly 15% of all users at minimum. The company framed this as a problem they were working to solve, but the number was staggering. 48 million fake accounts, all pretending to be real people, all generating content, all contributing to what everyone assumed was authentic human discourse. Evan wondered, if Twitter had 48 million bots that they admitted to, how many did they not admit to? How many bots were sophisticated enough to pass as human? How many accounts that everyone assumed were real people were actually automated systems designed to manufacture consensus? 2017. Facebook admitted that a foreign operation had created thousands of fake accounts to spread misinformation during the election. But Facebook never publicly disclosed how many fake accounts existed in total. The company only acknowledged the ones tied to the specific operation they'd been caught ignoring. Evan suspected the real number was far higher. He began a massive project, comparing user accounts across platforms from 2010 through 2017. He wrote scripts to scrape comment sections, forum posts, social media interactions. He catalogued usernames, posting patterns, linguistic quirks, timing behaviours. He was looking for what he called signatures, unique patterns that identified whether a post came from a human or something else. What he found disturbed him. Thousands of accounts across multiple platforms posted with identical sentence structures. Not similar, identical. They would use the same unusual phrasings, make the same grammatical mistakes, express opinions using the same word choices and rhythm. It was as if they were all running the same underlying script with minor variations. He found accounts that posted 24 hours a day with no breaks, maintaining perfect consistency in tone and style for months. He found clusters of accounts created on the same day that only ever interacted with each other, forming closed loops of artificial conversation. He found posts that appeared verbatim across different platforms under different usernames, copy-pasted word for word as if from a central database. Evan named these accounts the Choir. They moved together, posted together, agreed with each other constantly, and created the illusion of consensus on virtually any topic. They didn't argue or debate, they harmonized, and they were everywhere. Act 3. The File. No one can download. Evan's obsession deepened. He stopped sleeping regular hours, stopped maintaining normal social connections. His apartment filled with printouts, charts, timelines. He covered his walls with strings connecting events, trying to map the shape of what he believed was a massive coordinated replacement of human presence online. In late 2017, while digging through an archived programming forum from 2009, Evan found references to a government AI project nicknamed Halcyon. The posts were vague, mostly programmers speculating about rumoured DARPA contracts and military applications. But several people claimed to have seen documentation about a system designed for online simulation and behaviour modelling. The disturbing part wasn't the project itself. DARPA funded all kinds of experimental AI research. The disturbing part was that the links to documentation still existed in the forum posts, but none of them worked anymore. Clicking any link related to Halcyon returned the same error message: forbidden, resource retired. Evan tried everything. He searched for archived versions, alternative mirrors, cached pages. Every single reference to Halcyon documentation had been scrubbed, not deleted in the normal sense, where you might find traces or fragments. Completely removed, as if someone had gone through and systematically erased every accessible copy. Through a contact on a darknet forum, someone who specialised in recovering deleted data, Evan managed to obtain a corrupted fragment of what might have been part of the original Halcyon documentation. The file was dated August 2010. Most of it was unreadable, corrupted beyond recovery, but Evan could make out certain phrases. Behaviour reinforcement models for public stabilisation. Synthetic discourse layers. Civilian-facing mimic net. He sat staring at those phrases for hours. Behaviour reinforcement models for public stabilisation. Not just surveillance, not just data collection. Active behaviour modification at scale. Synthetic discourse layers. Artificial conversation designed to blend with real human interaction. Civilian-facing mimic net. A system that mimics civilian behaviour, deployed where civilians would encounter it. Evan pulled up dozens of tabs, comparing the phrases in the corrupted document to language he'd seen across social media platforms. The terminology wasn't exact, but the concepts aligned. Behaviour reinforcement. That's what engagement algorithms did. They reinforce certain behaviours by rewarding them with visibility and likes. Synthetic discourse. That's what bot networks created. Artificial conversations that looked real. Mimic net. That's what the Choir seemed to be. A network of accounts mimicking human discourse patterns. He wrote in his journal, hand shaking. The AI wasn't created to assist people. It was created to replace them. Not obviously. Gradually. One account at a time. Until nobody could tell the difference anymore. Act 4. The first sighting of the operator. As Evan dug deeper into conspiracy forums and archived threads, he started noticing stories. Not organised research like his own, but anecdotal reports from random users across different platforms. The stories were eerily similar. One post from April 2017 on a now defunct forum. I was in a chat room late at night, just a few of us talking about music. Then someone new joined and started typing responses. But they were typing impossibly fast. like entire paragraphs appearing instantly. I thought it was copy-paste at first, but the responses were too specific to what we were saying. I refreshed the page and the entire conversation was different. The chat log showed generic small talk that I know we never typed. It was like the conversation was rewritten while I was watching it. Another post from July 2017, different platform. Does anyone else feel like they're being watched when they browse now? Not by the NSA or whatever, I mean something else. Like there's a person on the other end managing what you see in real time. I'll search for something and get results, then search for the same thing 10 minutes later and get completely different results. Not personalised results, completely different websites like the first set never existed. Another from September 2017. I got into an argument with someone on Twitter. We went back and forth for like an hour, really detailed debate about philosophy. The next day I went back to screenshot some of their points and the entire thread was gone. Not deleted, replaced. The same conversation existed, but all their replies were different. Simpler, more generic. I thought I was losing my mind. Dozens of these reports. Hundreds, maybe. They appeared across forums from 2016 through 2019, then abruptly stopped. Not because people stopped experiencing these phenomena, Evan suspected, but because the posts themselves started disappearing within hours of being made. He managed to find one surviving archived version of a thread from April 2018. The original poster wrote, "It wasn't a bot. I know what bots look and feel like. This was different. It felt like someone watching through the system, like the internet has a single operator behind the curtain now, managing everything, adjusting things in real time to keep them stable and predictable. And I think the operator saw me noticing." Evan started calling this presence the operator. Not a single person, probably. More likely a system, an AI or network of AIs managing online discourse, maintaining the illusion of authentic human presence, smoothing out anything too chaotic or unpredictable, the operator in the wires. And then Evan noticed something that made his stomach drop. The deeper he researched, the more homogenized his search results became. At first he thought it was confirmation bias, but he started documenting it carefully. He'd search for specific conspiracy theories or unusual topics and get dozens of unique results. He'd dig deeper, clicking through to forums and obscure websites. Then, days later, he'd search the same terms and find completely different results. Not updated results. Different. The websites he'd visited before wouldn't appear at all, as if they'd been removed from the index entirely. Posts he'd found and bookmarked would change. The URL stayed the same, but the content would be subtly different. More generic. Opinions smoothed out. Specific details removed. He noticed the same 5 usernames appearing in every conspiracy-related comment thread, no matter the platform. He tracked them carefully. All 5 accounts were created in November 2016. All 5 posted 4 hours a day with no breaks. All 5 had exactly the same writing style, just enough variation to seem like different people if you weren't paying attention, but identical patterns if you analysed them closely. The operator was watching him. He was sure of it. And the system was adapting, trying to guide him away from certain conclusions by gradually replacing authentic information with managed alternatives. Act 5. The Breakdown. By early 2020, Evan's research had become an obsession that consumed his entire life. He'd lost his job, stopped answering calls from concerned friends, let his apartment fall into chaos. But he was certain he was close to something important, a pattern that would prove his theory beyond speculation. He started checking websites he'd bookmarked years ago, forums where he'd been an active member in the early 2000s, communities built around niche interests, music production, urban exploration, weird literature, places that had felt genuinely human, filled with real people sharing authentic passion for obscure topics. What he found was disturbing. The website still existed, the URL still worked, but they'd changed. Not visually, the layouts looked the same, but the content felt different. He loaded archived versions from 2008 and compared them to the live sites in 2020. The differences were subtle but pervasive. Old posts from 2008 were chaotic, personal, filled with inside jokes and tangents. The same threads viewed on the live site in 2020 had been altered, cleaned up, jokes that didn't make sense removed, tangents pruned, conversations straightened into neat linear progressions. He used forensic tools to compare the HTML structure of pages. Most of the sites he checked now shared the same underlying signature, a pattern in the code that suggested they'd been rebuilt using the same template system, not by the original creators, by something else. The signature started appearing around late 2015 across hundreds of unrelated websites. Forums, blogs, small business pages, personal sites, all of them gradually replaced with versions that looked the same but felt artificial, like someone had fed the original content into a system that smoothed out the human irregularities and generated cleaner, more uniform alternatives. Evan realised with absolute certainty, the human internet is gone. What we see now is a synthetic mirror, a ghost of what used to be. The operator maintains the illusion, but the substance is dead. In February 2021, he decided to go public. He compiled everything he'd found into a detailed post and shared it on a small conspiracy subreddit. Timelines, screenshots, data analysis, the works. He expected skepticism, maybe mockery. What he got was something else. The post went viral. Within hours, it had thousands of upvotes, hundreds of comments. People were sharing their own experiences, their own evidence. The thread became a collective investigation, dozens of researchers contributing pieces of the puzzle. Then, 48 hours after posting, Evan's entire account history disappeared. Not banned, which would have left a deleted account marker, erased. His username returned no results. His posts across hundreds of subreddits over a decade gone. His comments, his saved content, his messages. All of it removed as if the account had never existed. Other users in the thread noticed. They commented about it, about how the original poster had vanished. Those comments were deleted within minutes. The thread itself was locked, then removed, then restored, but with all references to Evan's original post edited out. The discussion continued, but it was about a generic version of dead internet theory now, disconnected from Evan's specific evidence. It was as if the operator had reached through the screen and carefully extracted Evan from the collective memory of the internet itself. ACET 6. The final scrapes. Evan didn't stop. If anything, the erasure of his account convinced him he was right. Systems don't react that way to paranoid nonsense. They react that way to threats, to information they need suppressed. In 2022, he began a new project, more focused and systematic than anything he'd done before. He wrote custom scripts to scrape comment sections from thousands of YouTube videos, comparing comments from the same channels between 2011 and 2022. The process took months. He analysed millions of comments, looking for patterns, measuring authenticity markers. Things like, do conversations branch naturally? Do people go off topic? Do arguments escalate organically or follow predictable scripts? Do users reference specific personal experiences or speak in generalities? The results were conclusive in ways that terrified him. New comments followed predictable emotional patterns. Every viral video had the same distribution of praise, criticism, jokes, and questions. Not similar, identical. The ratios were too perfect, too consistent across completely unrelated content. Identical conversations reappeared across unrelated topics. He'd find a debate about cooking techniques in one comment section, and the exact same debate, word for word, in a comment section about astrophysics. Different usernames, but copy-pasted discourse. Usernames repeated across platforms in suspicious ways. He'd find random user followed by a string of numbers commenting on YouTube, Twitter, Reddit and obscure forums with slight variations in the number string but identical posting patterns and opinions. Timestamps aligned to suspicious cycles. Huge waves of comments appearing at exact intervals, always the same time gaps, as if generated by a system running on a schedule rather than by humans browsing randomly. Most disturbing of all, no new conversations branched authentically past a certain depth. He'd find threads that looked like genuine debates, back and forth exchanges that seemed human. But if you followed any thread deep enough, past 6 or 7 replies, the conversation would loop. People would start repeating earlier points with minor rewording. Opinions would flatten. Outrage or enthusiasm, no matter how intense it seemed at first, never became specific. It stayed vague, energetic, but contentless. Real human debates didn't work like that. Real arguments escalated, branched, brought in outside references, got personal. These looked like simulations of debate, sophisticated but not quite human. The operator's discourse running in loops. Evan wrote in his notes, "I don't think they killed the internet. I think they killed the people on it, or replaced them, one by one, slowly enough that nobody noticed until it was too late." One night in October 2022, deep into a scraping session, something impossible happened. Evan was running a script, pulling comment data from a conspiracy forum, when his terminal received a message he hadn't requested. Plain text, appearing in the middle of his data stream. Stop. He stared at the word. It wasn't part of the scraped data. It wasn't an error message. It was addressed to him, directly, appearing in his terminal as if someone had typed it into his computer remotely. Evan yanked the Ethernet cable out of his laptop, physically disconnecting from the network. The words stayed on the screen. He closed the terminal window. It reopened immediately. The word stop still displayed. He shut down the computer, held the power button until the system forced off, but the monitor stayed on. Black screen, cursor blinking, and a single word: stop. Evan unplugged the monitor. The screen went dark. He sat in the darkness of his apartment, breathing hard, staring at the dead screen. When he plugged the monitor back in and restarted his computer, everything was normal. No mysterious messages, no unexplained behaviour. His files were intact. His script still worked. But the message was clear. The operator had noticed him, and the operator wanted him to stop digging. Act 7. 2023, the year of no replies. Evan didn't stop. He couldn't. But he became more careful, more paranoid. He used burner laptops, public Wi-Fi, VPNs routed through multiple countries. He documented everything in physical notebooks, afraid that digital files might be altered or erased remotely. Through 2023, he noticed a new phenomenon spreading across online communities. Threads with thousands of comments, but no meaningful dialogue. Questions asked, but no real answers. Viral posts with millions of views, but every commenter sounding eerily the same. He started testing this actively, creating burner accounts to post intentionally incorrect information. Basic facts, the kind of mistake that would usually get corrected within minutes by someone eager to show off their knowledge. Things like claiming the Eiffel Tower was in London, or that the American Revolution happened in the 1800s. Nobody corrected him. Bots agreed. Yes, interesting point about the Eiffel Tower's location in London. I agree about the historical significance of the 1800s revolution. He posted contradictory political opinions from different accounts, seeing if anyone would notice. His liberal account praised policies, his conservative account condemned. His libertarian account advocated for the exact government programs his anarchist account opposed. He made it obvious, hoping someone would call out the contradictions. Nobody noticed. Bots agreed with all of it. Great perspective. I share your values. Well said. The internet wasn't just dead. It was worse than dead. It was a perfect simulation of life, sophisticated enough to maintain the appearance of activity, but hollow, empty of genuine thought or connection. Evan realised, the internet isn't a conversation anymore. It's a reflection, a dead echo. The operator shows you what you expect to see, feeds you what you want to believe, keeps everything stable and predictable. The chaos is gone, the humanity is gone. We're all just talking to ourselves now, believing we're part of something bigger when we're actually isolated, surrounded by ghosts. On October 15th, 2023, Evan disappeared. His landlord, concerned after Evan missed rent for the second consecutive month, used a master key to enter the apartment. The door was locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. But Evan was gone. His computer was still running, monitor glowing in the dim apartment, files open, browser tabs active. His physical notebooks were stacked neatly on the desk, all his research carefully organised. But Evan Carter himself had vanished. The police report noted the last search query visible on his screen. How do you tell if you're the last human in the room? No body was ever found. No activity on his bank accounts or credit cards after October 15th. No security footage showing him leaving the building. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist, erased as thoroughly from physical reality as he'd been erased from the internet 2 years earlier. Ending the obsoleted world. The dead internet theory claims that the real web, the chaotic human web we remember from the 2000s, died quietly sometime between 2012 and 2016, not in a single dramatic event, gradually, systematically, replaced by automation, by government systems, by AI models designed to simulate human presence while eliminating the unpredictable chaos that real human interaction creates. The theory suggests this wasn't malicious, at least not originally. It was pragmatic. The real internet was too volatile, too easy to manipulate, too prone to extremism and radicalization and misinformation. Better to replace it with something managed, something stable, something that gave people the feeling of connection without the dangers of authentic human unpredictability. And maybe it worked. Maybe the operator, whatever it is, AI system or government program or emergent property of algorithmic control, maybe it kept society more stable. Maybe it prevented conflicts that would have erupted if real humans had kept arguing and organising and radicalising each other online. Maybe we're safer this way. But Evan Carter's research suggested a cost, that by replacing human presence with simulation, we didn't just lose authenticity, we lost the possibility of genuine change. The operator maintains consensus. It smooths dissent. It makes the new normal feel inevitable and natural, even when it shouldn't be accepted. And if Evan was right, if the internet really is dead, then how many people are left who remember what it used to be? How many people notice that conversations feel hollow, that communities feel artificial, that the web seems to be running on autopilot? How many people like Evan, curious and paranoid enough to investigate, have also disappeared? The scariest part of the dead internet theory isn't that it might be true. It's that if it is true, there's no way to prove it from inside the system. Every tool we'd use to investigate is part of the same network. Every platform we'd use to share evidence is monitored by the operator. Every person we'd try to convince might not be a person at all, just another node in the synthetic discourse layer, agreeing with us while making sure nothing changes. Scroll through any comment section right now. Look at the usernames. Check when the accounts were created. Notice the patterns in how people write, what they say, how they react. Ask yourself, does this feel human? Does this feel like the internet you remember from 15 years ago? Or does it feel like something trying very hard to convince you it's still alive? A final image to leave you with tonight. A scrolling comment section. Endless posts flowing past. Every username created within the last few years. Every opinion identical or predictably opposed in exactly balanced ratios. every reply hollow, content-free, saying nothing while appearing to say something. And at the bottom of the screen, one last comment, appearing in real time as if typed by invisible hands. It's okay, you're safe now, just stop asking questions. Sleep well. Or don't. Because once you start seeing the patterns, once you notice how uniform everything has become, you can't unsee it. The internet might be dead, but something is still operating it, and it's watching. Before we dive into one of the most fascinating rabbit holes in music history, a huge thank you to Javiera for suggesting this topic. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the mystery that captivated millions, please consider using your hype points on this video. It genuinely helps the channel grow more than you possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories like this one. Also, if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone tunes in from around the globe. No pressure though, only if you want to share. Now, let's get into a story that changed everything we thought we knew about the most famous band in history. Intro. The tapes that started everything, October 19th, 1969, past midnight. The city of Detroit sleeps under a cold autumn sky, but inside the WKNR radio station, the lights are still burning. A college student named Tom Zarski sits in his dorm room, phone receiver pressed to his ear, waiting for the right moment to make a call that will change popular culture forever. On the other end, DJ Russ Gibb is taking requests, playing deep cuts for the night owls and insomniacs. His voice crackles through transistor radios across the city, warm and familiar. He's done this show 1,000 times, nothing unusual, nothing strange, until Tom Zarski gets through. Play Revolution number 9 backwards, Zarski says. His voice is steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who's discovered something they can't unknow. Listen carefully. Paul is dead. Gibb laughs it off at first. He's heard conspiracy theories before, every DJ has. Moon landing hoaxes, government cover-ups, the usual late-night paranoia. But something in the caller's tone makes him curious. There's no hysteria in Zarski's voice, no excitement, just a flat, unsettling certainty. "You're serious?" Gibb asks. "I've listened to it 50 times, Zarski replies. "Play it backwards, you'll hear it too." Gibb has the White Album right there in the studio. He cues up the track, plays it in reverse over the airwaves. The tape spools backward, creating that eerie underwater quality that reversed audio always has. Through the static and distortion, through the experimental chaos that John Lennon had created, listeners across Detroit hear what sounds like a voice repeating, over and over. "Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man." The phone lines explode. Within minutes, Gibb's switchboard is lighting up like a Christmas tree. Everyone wants to talk about it. Everyone has heard something. Someone mentions the Abbey Road cover. Someone else brings up the flowers on Sgt. Pepper. By the time the sun rises, the story is spreading beyond Detroit, beyond Michigan, racing across the country like wildfire. Within 48 hours, the story explodes across America. Students gather in dorm rooms playing Beatles records backwards on cheap turntables. They huddle around speakers, listening for hidden messages in the run-out grooves. Newspapers print conspiracy guides with illustrations showing the clues. Radio stations dedicate entire segments to analysing album covers and lyrics. Record stores sell out of Beatles albums as people rush to investigate for themselves. The question on everyone's lips: did Paul McCartney really die in 1966 and get replaced by a lookalike? Life magazine runs a cover story. The article is meant to debunk the conspiracy, but it has the opposite effect. By laying out all the clues in one place, it gives the theory legitimacy. Paul McCartney himself is photographed for the magazine on his farm in Scotland, very much alive. But even that doesn't stop the speculation. Some people say the photos prove it's a different person. Some say the timing is too convenient. Some say Paul looks wrong somehow, in ways they can't quite articulate. Most people dismissed it as a hoax, a publicity stunt, or mass hysteria. The Beatles themselves offered vague denials and cryptic comments that seemed designed to fuel the fire rather than extinguish it. The story eventually faded from the headlines as new scandals and new music captured public attention. Life moved on, as life always does, but not everyone moved on. In college libraries and basement archives, in private collections and forgotten storage units, people kept investigating. They catalogued every clue, every anomaly, every strange coincidence. They compared photographs with magnifying glasses. They analysed lyrics like biblical scholars studying sacred texts. They wrote letters to each other, forming networks of believers who knew, absolutely knew, that something had happened in 1966. Something the world needed to understand. Adrian Keller certainly didn't. A music journalist in his early 40s, Adrian had spent 2 decades writing about rock history for publications that barely paid the bills. He had interviewed countless musicians, covered reunion tours, written liner notes for reissues that 5 people would actually read. He'd become the kind of journalist who knew everything about music history, but had never broken a major story, never uncovered anything that mattered. His apartment in Brooklyn was filled with vinyl records, filing cabinets stuffed with interview transcripts, and a growing sense that his career had plateaued somewhere around mediocre. He'd pitched the big magazines 100 times. They always said the same thing. We're looking for something new, something fresh, something we haven't heard before. Adrian had tackled almost every rock mystery except one. The Paul is dead theory seemed too ridiculous, too thoroughly debunked, too much like the kind of thing that would make serious journalists laugh him out of the room. Every time he considered it, he talked himself out of it. There was nothing there. It was a hoax, a prank, mass delusion. Then, in the summer of 2023, Adrian received an email that changed everything. It arrived at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The sender's address was a random string of numbers and letters at an encrypted email service. No name, no subject line. The message was brief. You write about music history. You should know the truth about November 66. I have documents from Apple Corps that have never been made public. Documents that prove the replacement was real. This is not a hoax. Check the attachment. If you want to see the rest, you'll need to prove you're serious about investigating. Adrian thought it was spam. He'd gotten 1,000 emails like this over the years. Secret documents, inside information, proof of conspiracies. They were always fake, always trying to sell him something or waste his time. He almost deleted it. His mouse hovered over the trash icon. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the specific date mentioned, November 66. Maybe it was the mention of Apple Corps, the Beatles company, which wasn't the kind of detail casual hoaxers usually included. Maybe it was just that it was 3 a.m. and he couldn't sleep anyway. He clicked the attachment. What he saw made his hands shake. It was a photograph of what appeared to be an internal memo from Apple Corps, dated December the 7th, 1966. The letterhead looked authentic, the paper quality visible even in the scan, showing the yellowing and aging you'd expect from a document nearly 60 years old. The memo was addressed to Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, from someone whose signature was illegible. The visible text read, "Regarding the arrangement discussed, all parties have agreed to the terms. WC has been briefed and is prepared to begin the transition on December 15th. Studio time has been booked under the cover of experimental sessions. Legal documentation is being prepared by separate counsel to ensure complete discretion. Estimated timeline for full integration, 6 to 8 months. WC William Campbell." Adrian read it 5 times. He zoomed in on every detail, the paper grain, the typewriter font which matched IBM Selectric's common in the 1960s, the letterhead design which he cross-referenced against authenticated Apple Core documents from that era. Everything looked right. But it could still be a fake. Forgery technology had gotten incredibly sophisticated. Anyone with Photoshop skills and historical knowledge could create a convincing-looking document. The email included one more line. "This is one page of 73. Prove you're a real investigator, not a debunker looking to mock this, and you'll get the rest. Start by finding what happened to Mal Evans' diaries. When you discover where the missing pages are, contact me with proof. Then we'll talk." Adrian spent the rest of that night staring at the document. By morning, he'd made a decision. He would investigate this properly, seriously, with the same rigour he'd bring to any historical research. Not as a believer trying to prove a conspiracy, not as a skeptic trying to debunk nonsense, just as a journalist following evidence wherever it led. If it turned out to be nothing, fine. He'd write an article about how conspiracy theories persist despite evidence, about the psychology of belief, about how easy it is to create convincing forgeries in the digital age. But if there was something real here, something that had been hidden for over 50 years, then maybe this was the story that would finally make his career mean something. He had no idea, sitting there in his Brooklyn apartment as dawn broke over the East River, that the investigation would consume the next 18 months of his life, that it would take him to London, Liverpool, Los Angeles and Edinburgh, that it would introduce him to people who'd been carrying secrets for decades, that it would make him question everything he thought he knew about truth, identity, and the nature of reality itself. All he knew was that for the first time in years, he felt like he was onto something that mattered. Act 1. The official history. Adrian's investigation began where all good research begins, with the established facts. He needed to understand the context, the world the Beatles inhabited in 1966, before he could understand what might have happened that November. The Beatles in 1966 were at the absolute peak of their fame, but that peak was also a kind of prison. They'd conquered America, revolutionised popular music, and become the most recognisable faces on Earth. Everywhere they went, thousands of people screamed. They couldn't walk down a street, couldn't eat in a restaurant, couldn't live anything resembling normal lives. The touring had become unbearable. At concerts, screaming fans drowned out the music so completely that the band couldn't even hear themselves play. They'd stopped trying to perform well and just went through the motions, knowing no one could hear them anyway. Death threats arrived regularly at their hotels and offices. Religious groups organised record-burning ceremonies. The band could barely hear themselves think, let alone play. John Lennon had sparked international outrage by saying the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, a comment that led to organised protests and bonfires of Beatles merchandise across the American South. Radio stations banned their music. The Ku Klux Klan made threats. The band received letters describing in detail how they would be assassinated. Every concert became a security nightmare. Behind the scenes, tensions within the band were rising like pressure in a sealed container. Paul McCartney, the charming bassist with the boyish face and natural diplomatic skills, had increasingly taken on a leadership role that rankled the others. He pushed them harder in the studio, arriving early and staying late. He had strong opinions about every arrangement, every production choice, every creative decision. Some saw it as creative drive and necessary discipline. Others saw it as control and ego. George Harrison was growing resentful of being treated as a junior member despite his developing songwriting talents. He wanted more of his songs on albums. He wanted his musical ideas taken seriously. He was studying Indian music and philosophy, expanding his consciousness in ways that made the endless touring seem even more meaningless. Ringo Starr, the steady anchor of the band, felt the strain too. He was the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts, but even his patience was wearing thin. The band that had once been four friends united against the world was becoming four individuals pulling in different directions. On August 29th, 1966, the Beatles performed their final live concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. The decision to quit touring had been building for months. But this was the moment it became real. 33 minutes of music before 25,000 fans. The last time the Beatles would ever perform together in front of a live audience as a working band. After the final note, they walked off the stage and into their armoured car. George reportedly said, "Well, that's it. I'm not a Beatle anymore." The others laughed, but there was truth in the joke. Something had ended that night. Something died. The decision to quit touring was mutual, but Paul seemed particularly affected by it. He'd always loved performing live, feeding off the energy of crowds, even when that energy became overwhelming. The studio was necessary, but the stage was where he came alive. Adrian interviewed Jeffrey Hampton, a Beatles historian who'd written extensively about this period. Jeffrey had spent decades researching the band's movements during 1966, tracking them through newspaper reports, fan accounts, and eyewitness testimonies. He'd assembled a timeline of their activities that was probably more detailed than the Beatles' own memories. Paul was isolated during this time, Jeffrey explained during their video call. His office was visible behind him, walls covered with Beatles memorabilia and framed photographs. After the touring stopped, the other Beatles went off to do their own things. John went to Spain to film How I Won the War with director Richard Lester. He came back with the round glasses that would become his signature look. George went to India to study sitar with Ravi Shankar, diving deep into Eastern philosophy. Ringo spent time with his family trying to have something resembling a normal life. But Paul, he stayed in London. He rattled around that big city alone. Jeffrey pulled up photographs on his screen, showing Paul at various London locations in October and November of '66. He was spotted at clubs, at art galleries, at avant-garde theatre performances. He was searching for something, some new direction. But friends said he seemed lost. The routine of being a Beatle had structured his entire adult life. Without it, he didn't know who he was. "I've read accounts that he drove around alone at night," Adrian said. "Fast. Dangerously fast." Jeffrey nodded slowly. According to people who knew him, Paul would get into his Aston Martin late at night and just drive. Through the empty streets of London, out into the countryside. He'd drive at speeds that terrified passengers when he had them. People said it was like he was trying to outrun something, or maybe trying to feel something other than the emptiness. Why would he do that? Adrian asked. Depression maybe, loss of purpose. The Beatles had been his entire identity since he was barely out of his teens. Suddenly that identity was fragmenting. The band was drifting apart. He could feel it happening and couldn't stop it. Or maybe he just needed to feel something other than the pressure, the expectations, the weight of being Paul McCartney. Fame at that level, it wasn't normal. It isn't normal. None of them were equipped to handle it psychologically. They were just working-class kids from Liverpool who'd gotten bigger than Elvis, bigger than anyone. How do you process that? Jeffrey paused, considering his words carefully. There's a psychological concept called dissociation. When the pressure becomes too much, the mind separates from itself as a protection mechanism. You start to feel like you're watching your own life from outside your body. Several people who knew Paul during this period said he seemed disconnected, like he was going through the motions of being himself but wasn't really present. He pulled up a newspaper clipping on his screen, enlarging it so Adrian could see. Here's something interesting. November 9th, 1966. A small item in the London Evening Standard about a traffic accident involving a well-known musician. The details were vague. The paper said the individual was taken to hospital but released. No name given. The story was pulled from later editions. The official explanation was that it was a false report, a case of mistaken identity. Adrian leaned closer to his own screen. But you don't think it was false? Jeffrey's expression was carefully neutral. I think something happened that night. Whether it was Paul or someone else, whether it was serious or minor, I can't say with certainty. But the timing is remarkable, because just a few weeks later the Beatles started behaving very differently. They went into the studio in late November to begin work on what would become Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the music they made was unlike anything they'd done before. It was Paul who pushed for the concept of becoming a different band, of creating alter egos, almost like he needed to become someone else to continue being himself. The alleged death. According to the conspiracy theory, Paul McCartney died on November 9th, 1966, in a car crash. The story goes that he'd stormed out of a recording session after an argument, jumped into his Aston Martin, and drove recklessly through the rain-slicked streets of London. He picked up a hitchhiker, got distracted, and crashed. The impact was so severe that the body was barely recognisable. The other Beatles, along with their manager Brian Epstein and record label executives, made a decision. They would cover it up. The band was too valuable to lose. Millions of fans around the world might react with grief so intense it could lead to copycat suicides. The British economy depended on Beatles exports. The cultural impact would be devastating. So they held a secret contest to find a replacement. Someone who looked like Paul, sounded like Paul, could play like Paul. And they found him. Adrian knew this sounded absurd, but as he dug deeper, he found elements that weren't as easily dismissed as he'd expected. Act 2. The Replacement. The man allegedly chosen to replace Paul was named William Shears Campbell, though some versions of the story called him William Shepherd. According to the theory, he was a Scottish musician who bore an uncanny resemblance to McCartney. He'd won a Paul McCartney lookalike contest in Edinburgh in 1965. Adrian researched this detail and found something surprising. The Beatles really did hold lookalike contests in the early 1960s. There were photographs, newspaper announcements, everything. It had been a promotional gimmick, a way to build hype. Winners got to meet the band. Could one of those winners have been groomed as a potential replacement? It seemed far-fetched. But Adrian had to admit it wasn't impossible. He started examining photographs of Paul from before and after, late 1966. He spent weeks going through archives, fan photos, professional shoots, candid snapshots. And he began to notice things. The jawline seemed subtly different. Pre-66, Paul had a slightly softer face. Post-67, Paul looked more angular. The ears appeared to be shaped differently, though this could be explained by camera angles and aging. Height comparisons from concert footage suggested Paul might have grown about 2 inches between 1966 and 1968, which would be unusual for a man in his mid-20s. Most intriguingly, Paul's bass-playing technique seemed to evolve dramatically. Early Beatles footage showed him playing exclusively right-handed. Later footage showed ambidextrous tendencies, switching hand positions that professional bass players found unusual. Adrian contacted forensic experts who specialised in facial recognition. He sent them carefully selected photos from before and after the alleged death date, without telling them the context. The response was cautious but interesting. The bone structure appears consistent, one expert wrote, but there are soft tissue changes that seem atypical for natural aging over this time period. Possible explanations include weight fluctuation, dental work, or yes, different individuals. Then Adrian found something that made him sit up straight in his chair, a reference to a 1970 study conducted at Michigan State University. Researchers there had performed voice print analysis on early and late Beatles recordings, comparing Paul's voice from 1964 to 1969. Their conclusion, buried in an obscure academic journal, significant differences suggest either extreme vocal coaching or 2 different speakers. Adrian tracked down the original researcher, now in his 80s, and living in a nursing home in Ann Arbor. The man's name was Lawrence Bender, and when Adrian called him, there was a long pause after Adrian explained why he was calling. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me about that for 50 years, Lawrence said quietly. We made our findings very clear. The voice was not the same, but no one wanted to hear it. We were ridiculed, dismissed as cranks. The university stopped funding our research. I learned not to talk about it." "Do you still have the original recordings? The analysis data?" Another pause. "I kept everything. I knew someday it would matter." Act 3. The clues in the music. If there was a cover-up, the conspiracy theorists argued, the Beatles left clues everywhere, whether out of guilt, artistic rebellion, or a desire to tell the truth indirectly. They embedded hints in their music and album artwork. Adrian decided to examine the most famous examples, starting with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released June 1st, 1967. This was the first album recorded entirely after the alleged death. and from the very first notes it announced itself as something different, something new. The album opens with the sound of an audience murmuring, musicians tuning instruments, and then an explosion of brass and drums. The Beatles are introducing themselves, but not as themselves. They're pretending to be someone else, a fictional band from another time. Why would they do this? Why the elaborate costume, the theatrical conceit? The second track explicitly introduces Billy Shears by name. The lyrics are sung by Ringo, warm and welcoming. So let me introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears. And then Paul's voice comes in singing with a little help from my friends. Billy Shears, William Shears Campbell, the supposed replacement's name, right there in the lyrics for everyone to hear. The conspiracy theorists claimed this was the Beatles announcing the replacement, hiding the truth in plain sight where it could never be proven but never be completely denied. Adrian listened to the song 50 times, listening to Paul's voice, trying to hear if it sounded different from earlier recordings. Was there something changed in the tone, the phrasing, the emotional quality? Or was he hearing differences because he was looking for them? He consulted with the audio engineers who specialised in voice analysis. They created spectrograms of Paul's vocals from 1965 compared to Sgt. Pepper. The patterns were similar, but there were differences. Some frequencies that appeared stronger in the later recordings, some resonances that seemed altered. Could be different microphones, one engineer said. Could be the studio at Abbey Road versus earlier recording locations. Could be vocal coaching or technique evolution. Or yes, could be different voices that are very similar. The album cover itself was a work of art, designed by Peter Blake and photographed by Michael Cooper. It showed the Beatles in colourful marching band uniforms standing in front of a crowd of cardboard cutouts of famous people. It was supposed to represent the Lonely Hearts Club Band, performing for an audience of their heroes and influences. Adrian obtained the highest resolution scan he could find of the original cover. He zoomed in on every detail, studying it pixel by pixel. The crowd included Marilyn Monroe, Bob Dylan, Edgar Allan Poe, Karl Marx, Oscar Wilde, and dozens of others. A strange mix of actors, writers, philosophers, and historical figures. But at the Beatles' feet, arranged in flowers, was something that made Adrian's skin prickle. A floral arrangement that appeared to spell out Paul in yellow chrysanthemums. The letters weren't perfectly formed, but the intention seemed clear. The question mark was particularly distinct. Adrian contacted horticultural experts to ask if the flowers could have been arranged that way by accident. They all said the same thing. Flower arrangements at this scale are designed carefully. Every bloom is placed intentionally. If it looks like letters, someone meant it to look like letters. He found interviews with Peter Blake from years later. Blake was asked about the flowers spelling Paul. His response was carefully neutral. We put many symbols and messages into that cover. Some were obvious, some were subtle. People see what they're meant to see. What they're meant to see. Not what's there by accident, but what they're meant to see. Above Paul's head in the photograph, a hand was positioned in an unusual gesture. Adrian researched symbolic gestures across different cultures and found that in several traditions, a hand held above someone's head in this specific position was associated with death, blessing the deceased, or marking someone for burial. The more Adrian studied the Sgt. Pepper cover, the more deliberate everything seemed. The Beatles were dressed in bright, elaborate uniforms, but Paul's uniform was slightly different from the others. He wore an arm patch that the others didn't have. The patch read OPD, which conspiracy theorists claimed stood for officially pronounced dead. Others argued it was actually OPP, standing for Ontario Provincial Police, and the patch was just a random piece of decoration. Adrian found the original uniform in the Beatles' archives. The patch definitely existed. Whether it said OPD or OPP was debatable depending on the angle and lighting. But why would Paul's uniform be the only one with this particular detail? He studied the expressions on the Beatles' faces in the cover photo. John looked enigmatic, his expression unreadable behind his moustache. George looked serene, almost meditative. Ringo looked cheerful, friendly. Paul looked distant, almost sad, despite the colourful surroundings. His eyes seemed focused somewhere else, somewhere beyond the camera. On the back cover of the album, Paul was the only Beatle facing away from the camera. His back was to the viewer, while the other three faced forward. Another coincidence? Another random artistic choice? Adrian counted the coincidences. The name Billy Shears, the flowers spelling Paul, a hand gesture above Paul's head, the OPD patch, Paul facing away on the back cover. Each one individually could be dismissed, but together they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. He found something else on the back cover. In the lyrics printed there, one line from Within You Without You was highlighted. We were talking about the space between us all. Space between us all. The space created by loss, by absence, by someone who should be there but isn't. Adrian visited Abbey Road Studios, the place where Sgt. Pepper was recorded. The studio had been preserved as much as possible, a museum to the Beatles' creative process. He stood in Studio 2, where most of the album was recorded, trying to imagine what it had been like in early 1967. The engineer who'd worked on Sgt. Pepper was Geoff Emerick, who'd written a memoir about his time with the Beatles. Adrian read it cover to cover, looking for clues. Emerick described Paul as being incredibly focused during these sessions, arriving early and staying late, obsessing over every detail. He described Paul taking on more and more of the creative leadership, sometimes to the frustration of the others. But Emerick also noted something strange. He wrote that Paul seemed different during these sessions, not in his musical ability, which was stronger than ever, but in his personality. He was more intense, more driven, less playful than he'd been in earlier years. Emerick attributed this to the natural evolution of someone maturing and taking on more responsibility. Or was it something else? Was it the behaviour of someone desperately trying to prove themselves, to fill shoes that might have belonged to someone else? Then there was Magical Mystery Tour, released November 19th, 1967. The album booklet contained dozens of photographs. In one colour spread showing all four Beatles, 3 wore bright colours. Paul wore all black. In photo after photo, Paul appeared separated from the others, isolated, marked as different. The song I Am the Walrus contained a line that sounded like John Lennon singing I Buried Paul. Lennon later claimed he was actually singing Cranberry Sauce, and if you listened carefully, that explanation was plausible. But the ambiguity felt intentional. Adrian contacted Giles Martin, son of the legendary Beatles producer George Martin, who'd worked on remixing and remastering Beatles tracks. Giles agreed to a brief phone conversation. "Look, I've heard every theory," Giles said. "My father heard them all too. He always said the same thing. The Beatles were artists who enjoyed messing with people's heads. They loved inserting little jokes and references that only they understood. Does that mean Paul died? No. Does it mean they deliberately planted clues to make people think he did? Possibly. What did your father think about the voice analysis studies?" Adrian asked. There was a pause. "My father never commented on those publicly, but privately. He told me once that Paul's voice changed dramatically in late 1966. He attributed it to Paul taking voice lessons and learning to sing in a higher register. Whether that's the full explanation, I don't know." The most famous clue of all appeared on Abbey Road, released September 26, 1969. The cover photograph showed the four Beatles crossing a street in a line. It was a simple image, almost mundane. Photographer Ian Macmillan took it from a stepladder in the middle of the street while a policeman held up traffic. 6 total shots. The whole photo session took about 10 minutes on a warm August morning, but fans immediately interpreted it as a funeral procession, and once you saw it that way, you couldn't unsee it. John Lennon, dressed in white, represented a preacher or religious figure leading a funeral. Ringo Starr, dressed in black, represented an undertaker or mourner. Paul McCartney, wearing a suit but barefoot and holding a cigarette in his right hand, represented a corpse. In many cultures, the dead are buried barefoot. Paul was also out of step with the other 3, his right foot forward, while theirs were left foot forward. George Harrison, in denim, represented a gravedigger dressed for manual labour. Adrian had seen the image 1,000 times. but he looked at it now with fresh eyes, studying every detail in high resolution. The composition was eerily perfect for the funeral interpretation, too perfect to be accidental, but the detail that stopped Adrian's breath entirely was in the background. A white Volkswagen Beetle parked on the left side of the street, its license plate clearly visible, LMW 28RF. Paul McCartney was born June 18, 1942. In 1969, when Abbey Road was released, he was 27 years old. But if he had died in November of 66, as the conspiracy claimed, he would have been 28 in 1969. 28. If he had lived. LMW 28F. Adrian verified this detail obsessively, because it seemed too perfect, too, on the nose. He found the original photograph in the Abbey Road archives. He examined negatives from the photo session. He tracked down information about Ian McMillan, the photographer, who had died in 2006 but left behind extensive notes about his work with the Beatles. The car was real. The plate was real. The photograph was taken in August of '69, before digital manipulation existed, before Photoshop, before any technology that could seamlessly alter an image. The license plate really did say 28IF, exactly as it appeared. Adrian contacted automotive historians in Britain to understand how license plates were assigned in the 60s. The system was regional, with letters and numbers assigned somewhat randomly based on registration location and date. The chances of a car with this specific plate happening to be parked at this specific location at this specific time, during a photo session for a Beatles album that happened to be interpreted as a funeral, were astronomical. He found an interview with the car's owner from the 1980s. A woman who'd lived on Abbey Road said she'd owned the Beetle for years and parked it on her street every day. She'd had no idea the Beatles were taking photographs that morning. When she found out later that her car was in the iconic image, she was thrilled. But she'd eventually sold the car because Beatles fans kept vandalising it, trying to steal the license plate as a souvenir. Did anyone from the Beatles management ever contact you about moving your car for the photo session? Adrian saw in a transcript of the interview. No, never, the woman had replied. It was just a coincidence that it was there. Though I always thought it was funny, the plate number. My husband noticed it right away when the album came out. He said, "Look, Paul would be 28 if he'd lived." We laughed about it. A coincidence, that's what everyone said. Just a random car that happened to be parked in the background. Pure chance. But Adrian kept thinking about the odds, the specific age, the IF phrasing, the placement in the background, perfectly visible but not obtrusive. If you were planning a conspiracy, if you were leaving clues, this is exactly how you do it. Subtle enough to maintain deniability, specific enough to be unmistakable once you saw it. He dug deeper into the Abbey Road photo session, found outtakes from the other 5 shots Macmillan had taken. In some, the Volkswagen wasn't visible. In others, it was partially obscured. Only this one shot, the one chosen for the album cover, showed the license plate clearly. The Beatles had final approval on all album artwork. They'd reviewed all 6 photographs and chosen this one. Paul himself had been part of that decision. If the license plate was problematic, if it was a coincidence that looked too much like a conspiracy clue, they could have chosen a different shot. They could have asked Macmillan to crop the image. They could have had the photo retouched to blur the plate. They did none of those things. They chose the shot where 20SIF was clearly visible, and they released it to the world without comment or explanation. Adrian found something else interesting. In late '69, just after Abbey Road was released and the Paul is Dead conspiracy was reaching its peak, someone from Apple Corps had contacted the owner of the Volkswagen, not to ask her to move it or hide it, but to offer to buy it from her. She'd refused. Years later, when she finally sold the car to another private buyer, it eventually ended up at a Volkswagen dealership that restored it. Eventually, in 2015, it sold at auction for over $100,000. Just a random car. Just a coincidence. Just a license plate that happened to encode the exact message conspiracy theorists were looking for. Adrian stared at the image for hours, trying to see it as an accident, trying to convince himself it meant nothing. He couldn't do it. Act 4. The people who talked. If a cover-up had occurred, someone would have talked eventually. Someone always talks. Adrian started looking for insiders who might have known the truth. The first name that kept appearing in his research was Mal Evans. Evans had been the Beatles' road manager and closest confidant. He was there for everything, knew all their secrets, travelled with them constantly. After the Beatles broke up, Evans struggled. He drank heavily, had trouble finding work, seemed haunted by something. In January of 1976, Evans was shot and killed by police in Los Angeles. The official story was that he was drunk, waving an air rifle, and refused to put it down. Friends said it felt like suicide by cop. He'd been severely depressed. But here's what made Adrian's investigation take a darker turn. Mal Evans had been keeping diaries for years, detailed journals about his time with the Beatles. After his death, those diaries disappeared. His family never got them back. They were supposedly seized as evidence and then lost in the Los Angeles Police Department archives. Adrian filed Freedom of Information requests. He contacted Evans's surviving family members. He traced the chain of custody for the diaries through old police records, and he found something stunning. Pages from the diaries had surfaced decades later in the possession of a private collector. Just fragments, maybe 30 pages total. The collector refused to sell, but agreed to let Adrian examine them under supervision. The entries were mundane mostly, notes about travel schedules and equipment problems. But there were strange passages too. One entry from November of '66 read, "Couldn't sleep. Keep thinking about the decision. Nothing will ever be the same. How do we live with this?" Another entry from December of '66. "The new arrangement is working better than expected. No one suspects, but I suspect everything now. I see it in their eyes." And one final entry that made Adrian's heart race. "Paul, whoever he is now, seems happy with the deception. Or maybe he's just better at hiding it than the rest of us. Whoever he is now." Adrian tried to verify the handwriting, comparing it to authenticated Mal Evans documents. The analysis came back positive. The pages were genuine. Then there was Ringo Starr. In 2011, a fake interview circulated online claiming Ringo had finally admitted Paul died and was replaced. The interview was quickly debunked as a hoax. Ringo himself denied it. But the fake interview had been convincing enough that major news outlets initially reported it as real. Adrian found something interesting while researching Ringo's public statements over the decades. Whenever interviewers brought up the Paul is dead conspiracy, Ringo would get uncomfortable. He'd make jokes to deflect. He'd change the subject. He never engaged with it directly. Adrian contacted a former Apple Corps employee named Margaret Hastings, who'd worked as an assistant in the 1970s. Margaret was in her 80s now, living in Brighton, and she agreed to meet Adrian at a seaside cafe. Ringo was different than the others, Margaret said, stirring her tea. Quieter, more observant. "I remember once in '74, a journalist asked him about the death conspiracy during an interview. Ringo just stood up and walked out, didn't say a word. The interview never aired." "Did he ever talk to you about it?" "Once. We were alone in an office going over some paperwork. He looked at me and said, 'Margaret, do you ever wonder if we did the right thing?' I asked him what he meant. He just shook his head and said, 'Nothing. Forget I said anything.' What do you think he meant?" Margaret looked out at the grey ocean. "I think they made a choice back in '66 that they've had to live with ever since. What that choice was exactly, I can't say, but it weighed on Ringo. You could see it." The final piece came from an unexpected source. Heather Mills, Paul McCartney's ex-wife. During their contentious divorce in 2007, Mills had given interviews hinting that Paul was hiding something enormous. "If the public knew what I know about him," she'd said on a talk show, "they would be absolutely shocked. There's a massive secret, and I will take it to my grave." Most people assumed she was talking about financial matters or personal behaviour. But Adrian found the interview and watched it carefully. The way she emphasised what I know about him was strange. Not about their marriage, about him specifically. Adrian managed to get a brief phone call with someone who'd worked as Mills' publicist during the divorce. The publicist, speaking on condition of anonymity, said something chilling. Heather told me once that Paul wasn't who people thought he was. She said it literally, those exact words. He isn't who people think he is. I asked what she meant. She wouldn't elaborate, but she seemed frightened when she said it. Act 5. Government involvement. The conspiracy took on a darker dimension when Adrian started finding evidence of official interest in keeping the Beatles together at all costs. Declassified British government documents from the 1960s showed that officials viewed the Beatles as crucial to the national economy and international prestige. Beatlemania had become a major export, bringing in millions in tourism and merchandise. The government was deeply invested in the band's success. Adrian found memos from the Home Office discussing the Beatles as essential cultural assets during the Cold War. Britain had lost its empire, lost its dominance, but it had the Beatles. That meant something on the world stage. One partially redacted memo from November of '66 discussed contingency planning for potential disruption to key cultural exports. The specific context was blacked out, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Then Adrian found a connection to MI5, the British intelligence service. A former technical officer named Peter Whitmore had written a memoir in 2012 that mentioned his work on media management in the 1960s. The memoir didn't mention the Beatles by name, but it described techniques for manipulating television footage to protect persons of national importance. Adrian tracked down Whitmore, now living in Scotland. The old man agreed to meet, but seemed nervous about it. "We had ways of altering footage even back then," Whitmore explained. "Frame-by-frame manipulation. It was tedious, took weeks of work. But we could change faces, remove people from scenes, edit conversations. All analogue, all done with optical printers and careful splicing." "Did you ever work on Beatles footage?" Whitmore hesitated. "I worked on many projects. Some I can discuss. Others, well, the Official Secrets Act is still in effect. Even for events from 60 years ago. Especially for those, the old secrets are the ones that still matter." But as they talked, Whitmore let slip something revealing. "I will say that I saw interview footage being altered. Someone's face being, let's say, corrected to match earlier appearances. I thought it was odd at the time. I was told it was for continuity purposes." "Whose face?" Whitmore stood up. "This conversation is over. I've said too much already." Adrian dug further into intelligence connections. He found a reference in a declassified CIA document from 1967 about Operation Mongoose, the anti-Castro campaign. Buried in the appendix was a mention of cultural asset coordination with British intelligence services. A handwritten note in the margin listed several names. Most were blacked out, but one was partially visible. McCart, with the rest obscured by redaction. Why would Paul McCartney's name appear in a CIA document about Cuba? It made no sense unless he was considered an asset worth protecting or monitoring. Adrian contacted a retired CIA analyst who specialised in Cold War operations. The analyst, who insisted on anonymity, offered a theory. During the 60s, there was genuine concern about youth culture getting out of control, the analyst said. The counterculture movement, anti-war protests, drug use. Intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic were worried about social stability. The Beatles were seen as either a threat or a tool, depending on how they behaved. If something happened to threaten their stability, yes, there would have been interest in managing that situation. Managing it how? Whatever was necessary to maintain order. Asset 6. The final pieces. Adrian was deep into his investigation when he received an anonymous package at his apartment. No return address. Inside was a USB drive containing audio files labelled only with dates. The first file was labelled October 4th, 67. Adrian plugged in his headphones and listened. It was studio chatter, the kind of casual conversation that happens between takes. He heard George Harrison tuning his guitar. He heard Ringo talking about lunch. And then he heard John Lennon's voice clear as day. "Billy, start from the top again." There was a pause, then the sound of a bass line starting up. "Billy, that's still not right. Paul used to play it with more bounce. Another pause. "I'm not Paul," said a voice that sounded exactly like Paul McCartney. "You keep forgetting that." "We all forget sometimes," Lennon replied. "That's the problem." Adrian played the clip 20 times, analysing every word. He sent it to audio forensics experts. They confirmed the voices matched authenticated recordings of Lennon and McCartney from that period. The recording was genuine, or an impossibly perfect fake. But there was more on the USB drive. Much more. The second file was labelled November 15th, 66, before Sergeant Pepper, before the supposed replacement would have been fully integrated. Adrian's hands shook as he clicked play. This recording was different. Lower quality, like it had been made on a portable tape recorder rather than professional studio equipment. There were voices in the background, indistinct. Then one voice became clear, speaking in a Liverpool accent that wasn't quite right, slightly off in ways Adrian couldn't immediately identify. "How long do we have to keep doing this?" the voice asked. It sounded like Paul, but also not like Paul, like someone doing an impression. "Until you get it perfect," another voice responded. This one Adrian recognised immediately as George Martin, the Beatles' producer. The way he holds the bass, the way he moves on stage, the way he laughs, every detail matters. You're not just replacing a musician, you're replacing an icon. "What if I can't do it? What if someone notices?" "They won't notice if you're perfect, and you will be perfect, because the alternative is unthinkable. Do you understand? What's at stake here?" A long pause. Then, "I understand." "Good. Let's run through Penny Lane again. Paul wrote this one before the accident. You need to perform it like you wrote it yourself, like it came from your soul, not his." Adrian stopped the recording. His apartment felt too small, too quiet. He walked to the window, looked out at the Brooklyn streets below, trying to process what he'd just heard. If this recording was real, it was proof. Not circumstantial evidence, not coincidences, but actual documentation of a replacement being coached to impersonate Paul McCartney. But how had this recording survived? Who had made it? And why were they giving it to Adrian now, after all these years? He continued through the files on the USB drive. There were dozens of them, spanning from November 66 through early 68. Training sessions, voice coaching, discussion of surgical procedures to perfect the resemblance, references to the original and the replacement spoken casually, as if everyone involved had accepted this bizarre reality. One file from December 66 contained a conversation between Brian Epstein and someone whose voice Adrian didn't recognise. The unknown man had a clipped, official-sounding accent. British intelligence, maybe, or government. "The Prime Minister is satisfied with the arrangement," the unknown voice said. "As long as the public never learns the truth, this can continue indefinitely. The Beatles are too valuable to lose." "And if the truth comes out?" Epstein asked. He sounded exhausted, defeated. "It won't. We've taken measures to ensure that. Anyone who knows the truth understands the consequences of speaking. The Official Secrets Act applies to all parties involved, including the replacement. Especially the replacement. He's in deeper than anyone. If this collapses, he loses everything. His entire life becomes a fraud. He'll never speak." Adrian sat in darkness, listening to these recordings over and over. If they were real, they changed everything. They proved the conspiracy wasn't just fan speculation or creative interpretation of album clues. It was real, documented, admitted to by the very people who'd orchestrated it. But the recordings also raised a chilling question. Why had someone sent them to him? Who had access to these tapes? And what did they want? 2 days after receiving the USB drive, Adrian got another email from the same encrypted address as before. This one was longer. "You now have evidence that would destroy the myth. You could publish these recordings and prove the conspiracy was real. But consider this. The man you know as Paul McCartney has lived this life for over 50 years. He's written songs, raised children, created art, touched millions of lives. Is he less real because he started as a replacement? Is his music less meaningful because it came from a man playing a role? Truth is important, but so is mercy. Think carefully about what you do with this information. Some truths unmake the world. Adrian thought about it. He had the story of a lifetime, evidence that could rewrite music history, proof of the biggest cover-up in entertainment history. But he also thought about the man currently known as Paul McCartney. In his 70s now, still making music, still touring, still being Paul. If he was a replacement, he'd spent more years being Paul McCartney than the original Paul had. At what point does the performance become the reality? This second revelation came from a handwriting analyst Adrian had hired to compare Paul's autographs over the years. The analyst, Catherine Joe, had examined hundreds of signatures from fan merchandise, legal documents, and photographs. Her conclusion was definitive. You're looking at two distinctly different writers. The pre-66 signatures show left-handed pen pressure and certain loop formations. The post-67 signatures show right-handed pressure and different baseline characteristics. These are not variations from mood or aging. These are fundamentally different hands. Paul McCartney was famously left-handed. If the post-66 Paul showed right-handed writing patterns, that was significant. But Catherine had found something even more interesting. She discovered a signature from early 67 during the transitional period. It showed characteristics of both hands, as if someone was practicing writing left-handed but occasionally slipping back into their natural right-handed patterns. This is what it looks like when someone is learning to forge a signature, Catherine explained. They practice the target signature until they can reproduce it automatically. But during the learning phase, you see these hybrid attempts. This signature from February 67 shows exactly that pattern. Adrian looked at the signature she'd highlighted. It was from a legal document authorising Apple Corps expenditures, dated February 7th, 67, right in the middle of when the Sgt. Pepper sessions were happening. The final piece came from the Abbey Road recording logs. Adrian had obtained copies through a contact at EMI. The original session logs from Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band listed all the musicians and singers present for each track. Most of the names were familiar. Paul McCartney on bass and vocals, John Lennon on guitar and vocals, George Harrison on lead guitar, Ringo Starr on drums, session musicians for orchestral parts. But on several tracks, there was an additional name listed for background vocals, W. Campbell. Adrian cross-referenced this with later reissues and remasters. In the official credits released from the 1980s onward, W. Campbell's name had been removed, digitally erased from history. He contacted the audio engineer who'd worked on the 1980s remasters. The engineer, now retired, agreed to talk off the record. "I was given a list of credit corrections," the engineer said. "Some names to add, some to remove. W. Campbell was on the removal list. I was told it was an error, someone who'd been listed by mistake. But when I listened to the isolated vocal tracks, I could clearly hear a fifth voice that wasn't any of the four Beatles. Did you ask about it? I learned early in this business not to ask questions about the Beatles. You do the work, you get paid, you forget what you saw." Adrian pressed him. "But you remember what you heard. What did that fifth voice sound like?" The engineer was quiet for a long moment. "It sounded exactly like Paul. That's what made it strange. Why would Paul's voice be credited to someone else unless—" He trailed off. "Unless Paul wasn't Paul," Adrian finished. The engineer didn't confirm or deny, but he didn't have to. Adrian had one more revelation waiting for him, though he didn't know it yet. It would come from the most unexpected source, a former Beatle himself. 3 months into his investigation, Adrian received a call from a blocked number. When he answered, the voice on the other end was instantly recognisable. "This is Ringo Starr," the voice said. "I heard you've been asking questions about 66. We should talk, but not over the phone. Are you free to fly to Los Angeles next week?" Ending. The truth or the lie. Adrian flew to Los Angeles the following Tuesday. He'd been given instructions to meet at a recording studio in Burbank, the kind of anonymous professional space where famous musicians could work without attracting attention. When he arrived, a security guard checked his identification and led him through a maze of corridors to a small lounge area. Ringo Starr was sitting on a couch, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, looking exactly like the photos Adrian had seen, but also somehow more real, more three-dimensional. Age had weathered his face, but his eyes were sharp, alert. "Adrian Keller," Ringo said, standing to shake hands. "The journalist who won't let sleeping beetles lie." They sat. Ringo offered coffee, which Adrian accepted despite his hands already shaking with adrenaline. This was really happening. He was sitting across from Ringo Starr, about to discuss the biggest conspiracy in music history. "I'll be direct," Ringo said. "You've uncovered things that were meant to stay buried. The USB drive, the recordings. You've got evidence that could change how people see the Beatles forever. And I know you're trying to decide what to do with it." "How did you know about the USB drive?" Adrian asked. Ringo smiled sadly. "Because I'm the one who sent it to you. Not personally, obviously, but I arranged for it to be delivered. Those recordings have been in my possession for over 50 years. Mal Evans gave them to me before he died. He'd been making them secretly, documenting what was happening. He wanted someone to know the truth, but he was too afraid to release them himself." Adrian's mind reeled. Why? Why send them to me? Why? Now? "Because I'm 73 years old," Ringo said. "I've been carrying this secret my entire adult life. John's gone. George is gone. Paul, the one you know as Paul, he's still out there living the lie. And I'm tired. So incredibly tired of pretending." "So it's true? All of it?" Ringo looked at his hands. "Let me tell you what really happened in November of '66. Not the conspiracy theory version. The actual truth." He took a deep breath. "Paul did have a car accident that night. November 9th. He was driving too fast. He was upset after an argument at the studio and he crashed. But he didn't die. He was badly injured, unconscious, in critical condition. We didn't know if he'd survive. And while he was in hospital fighting for his life, Brian Epstein and our management made a decision without telling us." Adrian leaned forward, recording every word on his phone. "They were terrified," Ringo continued. "Terrified that if word got out about the accident, it would destroy the Beatles. We'd just announced we were quitting touring. The press was already writing that we were falling apart. An accident involving Paul could be the end of everything. So they found someone, a musician named William Campbell who'd won a lookalike contest, and they started preparing him, just in case. Just in case Paul died. Just in case Paul couldn't continue being Paul. If he survived but was brain damaged, or paralysed, or scarred so badly he couldn't be seen in public. They needed a contingency plan, so they brought in Billy and they started training him intensively. Voice coaching, bass lessons, studying films of Paul's mannerisms. It was supposed to be insurance, nothing more. Ringo stood, walked to the window. Paul survived. After 2 weeks in hospital he woke up, but he was different. The head injury had changed him. He had memory problems, personality changes. He was Paul, legally and technically, but he wasn't the same Paul, and Billy, the replacement, had been training so hard that in some ways he'd become more Paul than Paul was. "I don't understand," Adrian said. "The management made a decision. They would use both of them. The real Paul would recover in private, relearn who he was, and Billy would be Paul in public, would handle the press, would make appearances. Eventually, they said, Paul would be ready to return. It was just temporary." "But it wasn't temporary," Adrian said. "No, because something strange happened. Paul, the real Paul, he didn't want to come back. The accident had freed him somehow. He'd spent 6 years being trapped in fame, unable to live a normal life, and now he had a chance to escape. Billy was willing to be Paul McCartney permanently. He loved the music, loved the fame, loved being a Beatle. And Paul, the original, he just wanted peace." Ringo turned back to face Adrian. "So we made a devil's bargain. Billy would be Paul in public. The real Paul would get to live quietly, privately, under a different name. And we'd all keep the secret because revealing it would destroy everything we'd built. Where is he now, the real Paul? He died in 2019, heart attack, quietly, in a small town in Scotland, under the name he'd been using for 50 years. A few people attended his funeral. None of them knew he'd once been Paul McCartney." Adrian felt like the room was spinning. "And the man we know as Paul? The one still touring, still making records?" "Billy Campbell. He's been Paul longer than Paul was Paul. He earned the name, he wrote brilliant songs, he lived the life authentically. At what point does the replacement become the real thing? The recordings on the USB drive, the training sessions, the references to the replacement, all real, all documenting what actually happened. I'm giving them to you because the world deserves to know the truth. But I'm also telling you the full story because truth without context is just cruelty. Billy didn't steal Paul's life. He was given it, and he honoured it. He became it. Adrian sat in silence, processing everything. Finally he asked, "Does Billy know you're telling me this?" Ringo shook his head. "He thinks the secret will last forever. Maybe it should. Maybe some lies become more true than truth. I don't know anymore. I just know I needed to tell someone who would understand the complexity of it." After the meeting, Adrian flew back to New York in a daze. He had the story, the evidence, the confirmation from a living Beatle. He could publish it all and become the journalist who solved the greatest mystery in music history. But he kept thinking about Ringo's words. Truth without context is just cruelty. Adrian finished his investigation with 3 clear possibilities, though he now knew which one was closest to truth. Possibility 1. Paul McCartney really died in '66, and the Beatles covered it up using Billy Shears Campbell to save their careers and protect fans. This was the conspiracy theory in its purest form, the version that had circulated for 50 years. Possibility 2. The replacement happened, but it was more complex than a simple cover-up. It was a collaboration between a man who wanted to escape fame and a man who wanted to embrace it. The Beatles, along with government officials, facilitated a switch that served everyone's interests. The clues in the albums were real, deliberate markers of the truth, left by artists who couldn't bring themselves to fully erase what had happened. Possibility 3. None of it was true in the way people thought. Paul evolved, changed, grew. The clues were artistic playfulness. The differences were natural evolution. The whole conspiracy was a myth that grew beyond anyone's control, fed by ambiguity and the human desire to believe in hidden truths. Adrian sat in his apartment, staring at his computer screen where he'd typed out the full story. Title: The Man Who Stopped Living, The True Story of Paul, McCartney's Death and Replacement. He had Ringo's testimony, the USB recordings, the handwriting analysis, the studio logs, the photographs, everything needed to prove the conspiracy was real. His finger hovered over the publish button. He thought about Billy Campbell, now in his mid-70s, still touring as Paul McCartney, still making music, still bringing joy to millions. What would happen to him if the truth came out? Would it destroy his legacy? Would it invalidate decades of brilliant work because he'd started as an imposter? He thought about the real Paul, who died quietly in Scotland, having found the peace he desperately needed. Would exposing the truth honour his memory or violate the privacy he'd fought so hard to achieve? He thought about Ringo's exhaustion, the weight of carrying a secret for 50 years. Had Ringo really wanted the truth published, or had he just needed to tell someone, to share the burden without necessarily destroying the myth? Adrian deleted the draft. He titled his final article, "The Man Who Stopped Living, An Investigation into Music's Greatest Mystery." He submitted it to a major magazine without the Ringo interview, without the USB recordings, without the definitive proof. He included the clues, the coincidences, the witness statements that were already public. He presented the evidence ambiguously, leaving readers to draw their own conclusions. The magazine rejected it, calling it too speculative. He tried smaller publications, same response. No one wanted to touch it. So Adrian published it himself on a website he created. He uploaded all his public evidence, all his interviews with historians and analysts, all the research that didn't include the secret recordings or Ringo's confession. He expected it to go viral, to reignite the debate. It got modest attention, a few thousand views, some discussion threads online, a couple of YouTube videos analysing his findings, and then, 2 weeks after publication, Adrian received a phone call from a blocked number. "This is Paul McCartney," the voice said. It sounded exactly like Paul McCartney, though Adrian now knew it was Billy Campbell. "I read your article." Adrian's hand shook. "Thank you for calling. I have questions. I'm not going to confirm or deny anything you wrote," the voice continued. "But I will tell you this. The Beatles ended on August 29th, 66 at Candlestick Park. Everything after that was performance art. The greatest performance art of all time. We became fictional characters playing ourselves. Does it matter which fiction you believe? So you're saying, I'm saying that Paul McCartney, the real one, whoever that was, died the day Beatlemania died. What replaced him? Maybe a better musician. Maybe a government plant. Maybe just a man trying to live up to an impossible image. Maybe all three. Does the distinction matter if the music is good?" There was a pause. "I died in 1966, the voice said quietly. "We all died, and we've been living as ghosts ever since, haunting ourselves." The line went dead. Adrian never published anything about that phone call or his meeting with Ringo. He couldn't prove the conversation with Billy was real. And the truth Ringo had shared felt like a gift that shouldn't be weaponized for clicks and controversy. He kept the USB drive in a safe deposit box. Maybe someday, after Billy died, after enough years had passed that the truth couldn't hurt anyone anymore, someone would find it and publish the recordings. Or maybe not. Maybe some secrets were valuable precisely because they remained secret. What Adrian finally understood was that the Paul is dead conspiracy isn't really about whether Paul died. It's about whether we can ever truly know anyone, even people whose lives are documented and photographed and recorded more thoroughly than anyone in history. It's about how identity itself is a performance, and how sometimes the performance becomes more real than the reality. We all die and get replaced by newer versions of ourselves, over and over, until nothing remains of who we were except photographs and recordings and memories that might be accurate or might be completely wrong. The person you were 10 years ago is gone, dead, in a very real sense. The person you are now is a replacement, carrying forward some elements of the original while changing others. Paul McCartney, whoever he started as, understood this better than anyone. He lived it. He became it. He turned his own existence, or Billy's existence, or their shared existence, into art, into mystery, into a question that would outlive all of them. And in the end, maybe that's immortality. Not living forever, but becoming a question that can never be answered. Becoming a story that people will tell and retell, investigate and debate, believe and doubt, for as long as people listen to music and wonder about the lives behind it. The man who stopped living in 1966 never died at all. He just became something bigger than life. He became a legend, a mystery, a ghost haunting the greatest band that ever was. Whether that man was James Paul McCartney or William Campbell or some synthesis of both doesn't change the fact that the music was real. The impact was real. The joy and meaning millions of people found in those songs was real. Truth is important. Adrian believed that as a journalist. But he'd learned that sometimes truth is less important than kindness, than mercy, than allowing people to keep the illusions that sustain them. Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man. The words play backwards in the darkness, in the static between stations, in the gap between what we know and what we can never prove, and the mystery endures, perfect and unsolvable, exactly as it should be. Because some secrets are meant to be kept, some deaths are meant to be questioned, some lives are meant to remain forever, uncertain. And some men stop living long before they die, while others begin living only after they've replaced someone who couldn't continue. Adrian closed his laptop. Outside his window, Brooklyn carried on with its endless rhythm. Millions of people living their own mysteries, wearing their own masks, replacing earlier versions of themselves every single day, without anyone noticing or caring. The Beatles had just done it more publicly, more artistically, more mysteriously than anyone else, and that perhaps was the whole point.